Goth Kids 3: Dawn of the Posers. In an episode focusing on the goth kids of South Park Elementary, Henrietta's parents send her to a camp for troubled teens, where she gets put into a room with a plant, returning not as a goth kid, but emo. The other goths try to find help for her, but cannot convince anybody that goths and emos are any different, so they ask the vamp kids for help despite being sworn enemies. The vamp kids have a plan to summon the original vamp, Edgar Allan Poe, to help them, but he mostly calls them all posers and says they don't understand him, and also that his name is now Nightpain. When the goth leader Michael is sent to the troubled teens camp, they decide they must rescue him, but they discover Michael tied to a chair inside of a greenhouse where a bunch of plants are shaking at him to turn him emo, while the greenhouse keeper tells him not to resist. The youngest of the goths, Furkel, reveals himself as an emo traitor and sabotages the operation to turn them all into emos. But when Nightpain is finally convinced to help for real, he learns that the plants were just regular ficus inside of vibrating pots. The plants all start to shout, asking if they're scared. When the greenhouse keeper says he is, a bunch of camera crews come out from behind the plants, revealing it was a prank as a part of a TV show. In the end, the goths return to Henrietta, pretending that they burned the emo plants to spare her the embarrassment of realizing that nothing actually happened. After years and years of making their deadlines within 6 days, South Park Studios finally failed to hit one due to a massive power outage that hit while they were working, though in their own words, they felt a bit relieved once they realized they had a proper excuse as their episode was taking longer than usual anyway. They even joke about how thankful they are there's a police report confirming it wasn't one of them intentionally ramming a substation just to buy some extra time because they benefited so much. The episode itself is more or less as important in the meta-narrative as the straightforward plot. The entire ordeal was just a prank by a TV show and it had no deeper meaning. We've seen before that the goth kids are a group who bond over the fact that they call everyone else posers, to cover up the fact that they themselves believe in so little that they don't even believe in themselves. And if a network TV prank was enough to convert them, this only confirms the fact. Taming Strange. Mr. Mackey is revealing the school's new IntelliLink system to the students, but the system is buggy and it keeps affecting things it shouldn't. Meanwhile, Ike has begun Canadian puberty, with the Canadian Minister of Health having a pre-recorded video to help that devolves into the man questioning why his wife queefed in his face. To try to calm down the hyper-aggressive Ike, Kyle takes him to a Yo Gabba Gabba concert in spite of the difficulties the IntelliLink system gives him in taking time off school. But during this concert, Ike goes on stage and attempts to tame Fufa's Strange, which gets him in trouble while convincing Fufa that she needs to be more adult so she isn't stuck performing for kids. Kyle gets a call from the Canadian Health Minister as he is trying to ensure every Canadian is happy with their coverage, where Kyle learns that the IntelliLink system mixed up Ike's laxatives with Tom Brady's hormones. The Canadian Health Minister realizes that his marital problems were stemming from stress from IntelliLink's problems, while Mr. Mackey finally upgrades the school system to a package where they tear out all the panels and replace them with a clipboard. Kyle and the rest of the Yo Gabba Gabba characters confront Fufa before she's about to put on an adult performance, trying to stop her from growing up too fast. And while Kyle's able to convince Ike to let puberty happen naturally, Fufa still goes out to show off her Strange. This episode was originally about Crestron Home Systems, a smart home system you could install in your house that the showrunner said that they had had problems with in the past. But then they were concerned that such a subject might be unrelatable as just a rich guy problem. Then around the same time, a partial government shutdown caused the launch of the healthcare.gov website to be buggy and unresponsive, so they shifted the episode to be about that instead, to make it something that their audience could relate to. What was less relatable, though, were the parodies of Yo Gabba Gabba, actually meant to reflect Miley Cyrus's recent MTV appearance where the former child star, as in former child, not former star, had done a sexually suggestive show to try to step away from the more sanitized image she had before. And of course, all of this was overshadowed in production by the Canadian Fancy Friend character, who offers advice and cigar smoke to the Canadian Minister of Health. The end result is an episode that is a mess of accidental social commentary made by people who were too focused on rich guy stuff to care or be affected, references to pop culture that were made without knowing what they were referencing, and several competing plot lines, none of which won out in the end. Ginger Cow. Cartman shows off a ginger cow to the rest of his classmates, something he made as a prank, though he insists it's real. Word of this ginger cow spreads around the world, reaching several foreign countries whose newscasters react with seppuku and the like. As it turns out, the three big Abrahamic religions all have a prophecy about a ginger cow that heralds the end times. When all three groups' leaders arrive to worship at once, they are forced into a meeting over how to handle the end of times, when they realize that perhaps the end was really the end of war and conflict. They all gather in Israel for a Van Halen concert, where peace in the Middle East is finally declared, only for Cartman to have a change of heart about revealing the truth, saying he'll keep it a secret if Kyle follows him around smelling his farts. Kyle agrees to this, convincing himself that he's actually a martyr for a great cause. But when Cartman is being recognized for discovering the ginger cow, Stan learns the truth, only to learn the rest of the details, then corroborate Cartman's story. But this causes the Middle East to erupt into chaos again, because the real prophecy was not about a ginger cow, but about a fat boy with a small penis trying to convince people about a ginger cow. In the end, Kyle realizes that he spent the whole episode smelling farts for no reason. Kyle's act of self-sacrifice is viewed as being totally pointless, as he justified continued abuse from Cartman as something inevitable, without considering a single alternative. For one, the world's religious leaders didn't put their differences aside because of the cow, but because they came to that conclusion on their own while they were gathered to discuss it. What was supposed to be a herald of the capital E end was instead reinterpreted to be a positive message, meaning that the ginger cow is even recognized as a symbol rather than something concrete. Kyle, knowing this, could have just told Cartman that no one would believe him, or that the people, now accepting peace, wouldn't throw it away like that because of something some fat kid claimed to do. These ideas aren't really debated, though, as South Park is a comedy, meaning that the meaning behind the conclusion is totally ignored in favor of the facts of the conclusion. There is no consideration that if people can put their differences aside for a kid's prank, then there wasn't really a huge barrier to stopping the conflict after all, other than the fact that some people just want fights. So after everything goes to hell after a lie is corroborated, with the moral of the story not really existing other than a criticism of the moral failing that Kyle had for assuming that a pointless self-sacrifice made him better than other people. A general criticism of every restrictive religion and the followers who claim moral superiority for doing something that benefits nobody, or in this case, smelling farts. Black Friday. Randy and several others have signed up to work as mall security on Black Friday, in spite of the warnings of the man in charge, though Randy is secretly planning on abandoning his post that Friday so he can be the first in line, as the first 30 people in the mall get a big discount. When the man in charge gets stabbed by an excited customer, Randy is given the responsibility and fake scar of leading the other mall security. The kids of South Park have also heard of this deal, with Cartman using it to rally several others behind his leadership so they can afford to get new consoles. But Cartman's group splits in half when some of the kids want to get PS4s instead of Xbox One, such as Stan. Cartman uses Princess Kenny's leadership to rally more and more people to their cause until word of this reaches Sony's president, who offers a PS4 bundle to sweeten the deal. Both sides recruit more and more of the children of South Park to their side of the console wars until the end of the episode, where it's revealed that Princess Kenny has flipped to the PS4, taking Minnie with her. Cartman sends Butters and Scott to George R.R. Martin's house to find out how Game of Thrones ends so they can base their battle plan off of that. But while there, Scott's blood sugar gets low, and George keeps delaying instead of delivering the pizzas he's promised. When Butters says he's tired of waiting, George R.R. Martin makes a call to help out. Microsoft enhances their offer on Black Friday by offering weapons and firearms to anyone waiting in line, to which the local media sleeps with the president of Sony to ensure he'll do something to make the violence on Black Friday greater, ensuring a bloodbath and a good story. So the CEO of Sony approaches Princess Kenny's camp, learning she broke off of the Xbox fandom as Cartman would not let her be a princess because only he could be royalty, and Kenny is offered a tiara, making her a real princess in the end. George R.R. Martin's plan is then unveiled, delaying Black Friday by a week but increasing the promised deal to ensure even more eventual violence. Now that Kenny is a princess, He begins to turn the tide of the console wars, stopping blockades of PS4 shipments and rallying more people onto Sony's side. Stan comes up with a plan to get inside the mall first through the Red Robin attached to the building, but he doesn't know how to gain entry until the Microsoft fans enter, offering an alliance and a plan to rent out the building for a wedding so they can sneak in first. But when the man whose garden Cartman keeps betraying people in tells Stan that Cartman is going to betray him, Cartman is forced to go to extreme measures to make sure no one finds out about the Red Robin wedding, getting Stan grounded on Black Friday. When Kyle learns of this tactic, he decides to betray Cartman before he can betray them. On the day of the Red Wedding, Kyle's forces surround Cartman, only for the CEOs of Microsoft and Xbox to enter unannounced, beating each other up to decide the winner of the console wars. Microsoft wins, but the carnage causes the victory to feel hollow, made worse when the boys travel through the bloodbath to actually get their consoles. In the end, Cartman realizes they don't need video games to have fun, and then they run an ad for the new South Park video game. This is another one of those episodes where explaining the ongoing cultural trends behind its creation makes me feel old, and this episode only aired like a decade ago. Game of Thrones was big. It's hard to overstate just how big Game of Thrones was. Everyone was either watching it, or they were actively trying to prove a point by not. The finale of the show, and George R.R. Martin's later failures to deliver on the next book during the period where people would have been hyped for it, made Game of Thrones as well as its source material, A Song of Ice and Fire, all but culturally irrelevant today, at least relative to what it was back then. I feel I have to mention this for younger viewers, even if my YouTube analytics say there are actually very few of you. There's a strange trend that was subverted by Game of Thrones, where shows that had interesting stories still felt the need to arbitrarily include some action sequence to show off their special effects budget, before going back to what people actually wanted to see. Game of Thrones was the opposite, where people came for the VFX and had to wait through promises of action scenes. This included several lengthy scenes where characters would walk through gardens to explain their plan out loud as they began to scheme, and affords made for the sake of adaptation, as many of the big reveals were conclusions that characters came up with in their heads with internal monologues or flashback sequences. The sheer number of named characters in the show was offset by the books having limited points of view, meaning that characters were defined in terms of their relationships to whoever narrated their actions, making it a bit easier to follow along with, even if Roy Dotrice did hold the world record for the highest number of voiced characters in a single audiobook for his narration. Can you tell I used to be a big Song of Ice and Fire nerd? Anyway, because of the complexity of the books that had to be simplified for casual audiences, these myriad scenes of betrayals and plans of betrayals were condensed to more immediate original scenes, mostly taking place as walks through gardens. As everyone swapped sides and argued over the merits of each, the comparisons to console wars became more clear. People picked an arbitrary choice out of the available ones to suddenly decide to die for, even if PC was the better platform after all. It's fitting then that by the end of the episode, once Black Friday finally comes, that people were disappointed with the actual result. As the boys walk through the carnage of the massacre, they realize nobody actually won the console wars, and it was just something hyped up to sell more of a product by drawing people to one side. The stores wanted it that way. The businesses selling their products wanted it that way. And only the customers really lost out as they beat and maim each other for goods that were overpriced to begin with. Much like how George R.R. Martin's works repeatedly pointed out how the powerful are rarely the ones who die in the wars that they start. The point of this three-part episode is that the people who stand to benefit from the violence on television are not really the ones ever affected by it. The Hobbit. Lisa Berger asks out Butters but gets rejected for being too ugly, with Butters saying he prefers girls like Kim Kardashian. Wendy claims that all of her photos are photoshopped and that in real life she looks like a hobbit. And to prove it, she photoshops a picture of Lisa to be more attractive. But rather than learning a lesson, Butters instead starts to date Lisa, showing the photoshopped picture off instead of the actual girl. Wendy tries to convince people that Lisa's not really attractive, but the other girls call her a hater and start photoshopping their pictures as well, until Wendy is the ugly one out due to never using Photoshop. She starts a campaign to have photoshopped pictures labeled as such, but people still just call her a hater. Meanwhile, Aquaman tries to convince people that his wife Kim Kardashian is not a hobbit, though his attempts to explain all his evidence always backfire. Eventually, he admits to Wendy that Kim is a hobbit, but because of Photoshop, she can pretend to be Beyoncé. Wendy then drops her cause and photoshops herself thinner. by this point explaining the harm that over-airbrushed images can do to a child's self-image is an overplayed point. Even decades before this episode aired, there were concerns over how the generation of girls and boys growing up exposed to beautiful, non-existent people would turn out. And this is to say that, despite it being more or less common knowledge that everything you see on TV and the internet is carefully curated to ensure that it looks just right to present a certain image, people will still fall for these narratives, though. That the guy on the reality show is a hardcore survivalist, even though the mud on his face was applied in a makeup trailer. That the people on red carpets wait to have their photos taken in specific spots because that's where the lighting makes them look the youngest. That the fitness influencer is on steroids and they don't actually take the product they're peddling. That the YouTuber making 13-hour video essays doesn't spend hours of his life editing out the ers and ums and the burpings out of his recordings. There's a lot of burping. It's a depressing point to make, and this episode does not shy away from presenting it that way, but by the end of this plot, Wendy has accepted the role that manipulation plays in our society. If you try to point out that someone is a fraud, not only the person you're pointing the finger at takes offense, but so does everyone else, because deep down, everyone's a fraud. Pretending to be things we're not. So if lying about who you are makes you feel a little bit better about that, there's no inherent harm in that. The only harm occurs when people forget that it's all an act and start to genuinely believe they are the person they're pretending to be, instead of acknowledging it as a form of visualizing who you want to become. Go fund yourself. The boys finally find a name for their startup company that hasn't already been used. Furry Balls plopped menacingly on the table incorporated. But they're not really happy with the name. That is, until Cartman learns that the trademark for the Washington Redskins was pulled, and they can freely use that name as it already has brand recognition. So their new company, the Washington Redskins, immediately becomes a success, raising tons of money for no reason, but also drawing the anger of the original Redskins, the football team. Though, as he tries to appeal to Cartman's sense of decency, they're rebuked. Stan and Kyle realize that their company doesn't stand for anything, so they leave to go back to Furry Balls plopped menacingly on the table, though this fork also splits up as Stan still doesn't like the name. Meanwhile, the NFL team owners have a meeting where they realize their commissioner bot's not working to fix the issue, so they pressure Cartman to at least change his logo, which he does by making it even cruder than before. Still not happy with the fact that the Redskins, the football team, is treated like a joke due to Cartman's antics, the team raids the Kickstarter office, burning it to the ground and causing none of the funding that was supposed to reach the companies to go through. So the boys agree to a merger, settling on the name Washington Redskins after all. But that weekend, when the Redskins fight the Cowboys, the whole team walks out as they can't take their uniforms seriously anymore, leaving just the coach to take the field himself. After the massacre, people begin to protest the boys, forcing them to give up and go back to school. There is an advantage in business that comes with being totally morally bankrupt. Taking a stand for something means that your business must now uphold that ideology, and when the money and fame inevitably goes to the heads of the guys at the top and they start acting like selfish jerks, the company goes under scrutiny for lying for money. But when the company only stands for making more money and never pretends otherwise, it winds up being good for business when some human rights infraction occurs. It's why a brand being revealed to use slave labor overseas or mistreating its domestic workers rarely actually hurts their stock price. Investors now know that the brand managers are willing to do anything to get them a return on their investment. Human rights and profit have always been at odds with one another. South Park, as usual, shifts the subjects of their satire around a bit to show that some conflicts have nothing to do with the people involved, but the actions that are performed. The Washington Redskins, football team, are treated as the indigenous tribe, as Cartman's company is the corporate entity exploiting and diluting their image for profit. Part of the reason why this is seen as so bad for the group it targets has far less to do with the fact that they've trademarked a slur, and more to do with the total indifference that people have to whether or not this winds up hurting anyone, because it doesn't hurt the brand owners specifically, so they don't care. Gluten-free Ebola. The whole school is still mad at the boys for the events of the previous episode, so to win back the favor of everybody, they decide to throw a massive party for Scott Malkinson, as they assume no one would skip out on a benefit. But a few of the people of South Park are concerned with whether or not the party will have gluten-free options. So a scientist from the USDA arrives to give a seminar on what gluten actually is, though when he tries to prove the substance is harmless, he explodes, and his dick flies off. So the town of South Park throws away every product they have with gluten in it, meaning there's no cake or pizza for the party the boys are trying to throw. Worse is that Randy is under quarantine for drinking a beer, so Stan can't even ask him about the one coworker he knows who knows Lord, who was supposed to play at their party. With no food, music, or junk food, Cartman starts breaking down and hallucinating Aunt Jemima parodying The Stand, where he hears that the food pyramid is upside down. He calls the USDA and tells them of this, with the scientists managing to balance people's diets by making their meals mostly meat and fat. The party is a success, and Randy gets let out of quarantine to sing while dressed as Lord. In order to make this episode's portrayal of the gluten-free diet authentic, Matt and Trey had everyone in the office go gluten-free for a few days so they could accurately describe their symptoms and explain what they felt in the episode, and if they needed crab people ending to wrap things up, then so be it. But what they found after a few days was that everyone genuinely felt much less bloated and more energetic, which annoyed them as they'd already mentally prepared to make an episode about fad diets, only to deduce on their own that this was not one of those. But in typical South Park fashion, just because they like something doesn't mean they won't still make fun of it. Here we see the city of South Park overreact to the newly discovered dangers of gluten-free products, despite having consumed them for years. Though even this is called into question as previous models of healthy diets were called outdated, for good reason too. It's hardly a secret anymore that the food pyramid that was so pervasive in American schools was less of a guide to healthy eating and more of a guide on how to subsidize American farmers. Americans on average get about half their calories from carbohydrates, far more than most other places in the world, which are typically around a third. This revelation is then treated like a plague has been unleashed on the US, with the overreaction to gluten being treated like an ongoing overreaction to Ebola, a health scare that swept through the US with the scare part being far greater than the health part, ultimately making people wonder if the quarantines and panics were worth it. Remember this, it will be important later. The Sissy. Tired of waiting in line at the boys' bathroom, Cartman dons a bow and enters the girls' bathroom so he won't have to wait. Principal Victoria wants to fight this as she knows Cartman isn't actually transgender as he claims, but Mr. Garrison points out that the media won't know that, and they ought to just let him do what he wants. But the girls of South Park Elementary are upset about the smell of Cartman and demand that something be done about it. So the school decides to make an executive bathroom to keep Cartman separate. This bathroom winds up being far nicer as Cartman designs it himself, so the next day Wendy claims to be Wendell and enters the executive bathroom, making Cartman furious and blaming Stan, who he calls a homosexual, for dating a man. Confused, Stan asks Randy if people can be one way on the outside and a different way on the inside, and Randy confesses what a reporter has been trying to uncover for days, that Lord is actually Randy's alternate ego, something he came up with to avoid a guy who stank up the bathroom at work, but has now become a pop sensation. But when Randy's secret is about to be revealed, he gives up the life only for Sharon to encourage Lord not to give up just because some people don't like her work. Lord returns to making music, the journalist trying to reveal the story gives up, and South Park Elementary lets the kids use whatever bathroom they want to, unless they judge other people, in which case they have to use the cis bathroom, something Stan doesn't actually mind. The previous episode had Randy pretending to be Lord after he claimed that he knew a guy who knew her personally, the implication being that Randy was just making stuff up to sound impressive, only to be called on the lie. But then a journalist from Spin magazine wrote a bizarre piece about how the episode was disrespectful to the artist, having fun at her expense, despite the gag very clearly falling in the category of jokes South Park makes by choosing a random name from the news and not actually featuring anything about them. So to make fun of people who didn't get the joke from last episode, Randy becomes Lord full-time instead of as a running gag, with the man investigating her real identity with the intent of bringing it up over and over. Of course, this sort of mudslinging about celebrities is looked down upon by, quote, normal people who really don't care about the intimate details of the lives of strangers. This is played with by putting it alongside a story about cisgendered people versus others, who use public restrooms that some believe they don't belong in. When it comes down to it, though, whether a person belongs in a bathroom or not doesn't really affect anyone else in society, and unless you're part of the small percentage of people who loves crawling underneath bathroom stalls and checking out strangers, then nothing really changes. At least, there's no danger that doesn't exist in both bathrooms, regardless of gender. At the end of the episode, students are allowed to use whatever bathroom they want, as people realize that they really don't care, and the few that do care enough that they would start digging into other people's private lives and private parts ought to be the ones separated out. Handy car. Timmy has started a new business, Handy Car, where he drives people around South Park in his wheelchair. But the taxi drivers are upset that they're losing business, and Nathan is upset that Timmy's raising money for summer camp because he hates going. So Nathan works with the cab drivers to sabotage Handy Car, to no success because they tried to break his legs, as more and more people of South Park begin to drive for Handy Car. So Nathan tries to prove Handy Car is a bad service by working with Tesla to restart the wacky races, with many different forms of the future of transportation racing to see who's the best. South Park panic buys all the cereal and pajamas to prepare for a Saturday morning just like their childhood. The race begins, and through various shenanigans, most of the cars are destroyed or incapacitated, with Timmy winning out in the end as hundreds of Handy Car drivers rush to his aid to defeat Elon Musk. In the end, Timmy simply sells his business to Musk and uses the money to pay for summer camp, with Nathan being forced to go by his parents. Brought up repeatedly through this episode is the concept of the free market, that a superior service will win out over an inferior one, only for the people offering inferior products to lash out by saying it's unrealistic and then trying to win a battle over market share by sheer force. Worth mentioning at the time is that Uber once vetted their drivers much more thoroughly and had a reputation for clean cars, safe drivers, and business practices that were more consumer-friendly. Of course, these days that's not quite the case. As it turns out, it is not profitable to run a business this way, and that was just a scheme to undercut the existing marketplace of taxis, then replace them, then jack up prices and cut costs until they were just taxis again. This is far from an isolated incident. Streaming was able to overtake cable by being more convenient and cheaper, only for streaming models to start becoming profitable based off exclusivity, until before long, people who wanted to watch things with the same variety and freedom as cable found themselves juggling multiple subscriptions and paying far more. The internet was far more convenient than ordering from a catalog until it took over enough to decentralize where until now products that are affordable are all hastily made and vetting for quality is harder than ever. It's not like this is entirely the fault of consumers, though. Free markets work best when multiple businesses are competing on equal footing for that market share, but some will try to squeeze out as much money as possible from their existing customer base, as it's more profitable in the short term to do this. Uber didn't actually have a positive cash flow for the first several years it operated, the years where it was killing the taxi industry, but when you don't plan long term, you risk losing everything to someone who does. It's just a matter of time now before the next Uber comes along and kills Uber, as investors don't want to eat the cost of competition once again. The Magic Bush. Cartman finds out Butters' dad has a drone, so he, Cartman, and Kenny take it out and wind up spying on Clyde's mom. When the other kids at school find out that Cartman has a video of her bush on his phone, he uploads it to the internet to cover that he was the one who took it, later making a music video about it to cover up when Kyle overhears him mentioning the first video. Meanwhile, the whole town of South Park is concerned with this invasion of her privacy, so they form a neighborhood watch of drones that fly around, spying on the drones that are spying on people. But when Randy's drone is shot down by the police for spying, the protesting drones become reason for the National Guard drones to come in and preserve the peace, which means there are now drones patrolling the skies and preventing anyone from having any privacy. But Stephen Scotch starts to grow concerned when he realizes his drone was flown lately, assuming it's haunted when Butters denies responsibility. He starts digging and finds out the video of Craig's mom also has millions of views, despite everyone claiming they didn't watch it. So people assume the drones themselves are sentient and causing the privacy violations. In the end, Cartman uses an inflatable doll with a massive bush to lure the drones away, drowning them Pied Piper style in Stark's Pond. As the showrunners put it, the first time they were exposed to a drone outside of flying one themselves, seeing someone randomly filming them while at a cafe, was the first time they felt like they lived in the future, but in a bad way. The fact that new technology was so quickly being used to violate people's privacy with little recourse felt like it was a shift to society where people would steadily have to get used to everything they did being public, even if they didn't want it to be. Part of this is referenced by Cartman through this episode as a response to several leaked private images of celebrities that spread around the internet during that time. The fact that these were shared and reshared over and over again showed the real reason privacy everywhere was being eroded. People wanted it to be that way. Everyone in South Park claims not to have seen or downloaded the images of Craig's mom, despite the fact that the video is still being shared. Everyone claims not to be using their drones to spy on other citizens, but there are still drones outside everyone's window. For all the talk about invasions of privacy, there's far more discussion on who is being violated than who is doing the violating. And in the end, people don't have privacy not because of the drones themselves, but because of the pilots. Freemium isn't free. Jimmy tells Stan about the new Terrence and Phillip mobile game, which mostly consists of tapping on coins, then spending real money to tap more. Terrence and Phillip were unaware this game was made without their knowledge, but the Canadian Minister of Mobile Gaming assures them that this is what every industry does: offer a product that's almost good, and then making most of their money from a small percentage of addicts. Addicts like Stan, who has spent tons of money on the game without realizing it, just like his grandfather who's addicted to slot machines. His friends tried to have an intervention, including Jimmy, who was hired by Canada to push the game to pay for his own freemium addiction, and Jimmy implores Stan to pray to a higher power. Stan prays and summons Satan, who sits down with Stan to explain dopamine and addictive tendencies, eventually learning of the app himself, which was made by the Canadian Devil. So Satan possesses Stan's body and heads to Canada, fighting the Canadian Devil and liberating Canada from his grasp. In the end, Stan and his grandpa play some board games to cope with their addictions as Canada rebuilds without extracting money from addicts. Matt and Trey were approached to work on a freemium mobile game prior to this episode airing, Terrence and Phillip once again filling in as the role of the duo like they've done before. Their concerns with creating a new game were largely from how to best adapt a South Park-esque story to fit the medium, only to be shocked when they were told that mobile games were often created with the monetization first and the gameplay as an afterthought. This to them felt predatory, though they couldn't quite understand why, as they struggled to come up with a type of product or service that didn't do the same thing. A lot of companies are dependent on a small number of whales funding their service while they break even on the rest of the customer base, with mobile games simply being an exaggeration of these business models. To claim there is something inherently evil about this format is to claim that there's something inherently evil about capitalism, something Matt and Trey are hesitant to do as outspoken libertarians. Preying on people's natural weaknesses and exploiting human flaws is basically just all advertising is, and it's even explained in episode as being something that Satan designed. In the end, it's considered to be a moral failing to give in to an addiction, though not in quite such a black and white term, as they still acknowledge the world is full of guys like Randy who are addicts but don't think of themselves as such. Grounded Vindaloop. Cartman is walking Butters through what he has convinced him is virtual reality when he's really just wandering around South Park as Cartman talks to him through a walkie-talkie. But after seeing Butters go rogue and starts beating up his parents and stealing their car, he winds up in a hospital where Cartman tries to convince him he's still in VR. But the episode then cuts to the real world, where Cartman has been discovered unconscious with a headset on as the other boys try to go into VR to convince him to leave. They send Kyle, but when Kyle tries to warn Cartman, Cartman is the one telling Kyle he's in VR. They keep calling customer service to ask for help, but only manage to contact Steve, who mostly asks them if he's offered good customer service. After going several layers deep into VR, or maybe none, Steve eventually has a conversation with himself where he warns the boys that they called customer service from inside the VR, and that's what caused them to be trapped. After telling Steve they did, in fact, have good customer service, the simulation shuts down, and a live-action group of boys complains about how bad the graphics were. Cock magic. The boys skip out on watching girls volleyball to attend a Magic the Gathering game Kenny's playing in. The next day, while bragging about how cool it was, the janitor overhears the conversation and invites them to something more hardcore: cock magic, as in roosters playing card games. After watching one of these games, Kenny fears he's being overshadowed, so they buy a chicken themselves who they name McNuggets and have Kenny train it to play Magic, winning games and eventually getting invited to underground tournaments at Panda Express. But when they see his competition, Gadnook, Breaker of Worlds, the boys withdraw McNuggets from the competition and enter Kenny instead. Meanwhile, Randy has also gotten back into cock magic himself, as in magic involving his penis, and starts performing at children's parties before eventually playing the halftime show at Kenny's fight against Gadnook. The police rush in to break up the illegal cock magic ring, only for Randy to interrupt, impressing the police by shooting off his dick and creating a distraction for everyone to escape. In the end, Stan decides to involve McNuggets in a new sport that combines magic with girls' volleyball to finally get people interested in that. South Park is well known for taking extreme concepts and finding the mundanity in what most would find offensive or appalling, taking refuge in their sheer audacity of what it is they're presenting on the screen, then building to even more absurd heights. And Randy is considered out of date for trying to do this exact thing, traumatizing a group of children by exposing himself to them as he assumes that the once unacceptable realm of cock magic is now accepted by a progressing society. But for once, this episode does the exact opposite, taking something mundane and turning it into the horror some fear that it could be, a children's card game turned into blood sport. I had to say it. It's not the first time that South Park has taken something somewhat childish and made the kids act like it was a big deal. In fact, some of the best episodes of South Park are those where the kids just act like kids, only to get into adult topics without really understanding what's going on. But in spite of viewer demand for more episodes like this, the show would be harmed by this sort of thing becoming more common. The novelty of such an idea is what makes it refreshing to see that tropes are being played straight, so it has to be done sparingly to actually work. If the kids were just kids all the time, then South Park wouldn't be South Park. But likewise, if the kids got into heavy topics all the time, the show would also lose its charm. It takes a careful balance to achieve the actual harmony that makes South Park a good show, and Randy serves as the opposite point of that balance, letting the showrunners take the more profane jokes they want to, without taking focus away from the main four characters. #rehash. Kyle is excited to play games with Ike over the weekend, but Ike only wants to watch PewDiePie play the game instead. When he complains to his friends, Cartman learns that you can make money by reacting to things online, and he begins to appear as a commentary window over other scenes as Cartman Bra. Meanwhile, Randy is told that he has to perform as Lord in a Woman of Rock concert, that it also includes the hologram of Michael Jackson, though Lord is concerned about the fact that rock has devolved to fake singers and rehashes. But when she goes on stage to perform an acoustic song, the audience hates her, and in her panic she accidentally frees the hologram Michael Jackson, so Lord tries to perform more sexualized like her manager told her to, only to get booed even more, although this is considered a success as people are reacting to it. When Randy tries to quit the business and confess the truth about everything, Lord's manager says he won't let that happen, threatening to replace the singer with a hologram. The company that makes these holograms is trying to recapture the escaped Michael Jackson, releasing Tupac into the wild to do the job. #happy holograms. Kyle is trying to save the living room by getting a hashtag trending, and this hashtag catches the attention of the hologram of Bill Cosby, who offers to put their trend on an upcoming holiday special. Meanwhile, Randy has tried to go to the police to warn them about holograms replacing real people when they arrest the hologram of Michael Jackson. But when they're trying to figure out if he's black or not, Tupac bursts in and they all try to strangle him, giving Randy and Michael Jackson cover to leave. The holiday special begins as Stan and Kyle discover it's been co-opted by Cartman to promote himself, so they try to stop the performance, with Stan revealing that Lord is his father, only for the executive in charge to kidnap Stan to keep Randy from doing anything. Randy, meanwhile, has decided to confess to being Lord, so Shelley hears it from him instead of from the internet, when Michael Jackson and Tupac arrive, revealing that Tupac does not want to kill him, but rather team up to shoot the executives. Back at the holiday special, people are turning against Cartman Bra, hate watching him so much that he becomes more and more powerful, until soon he is trans-trending, and he can finally get his own bathroom. But when Kyle realizes that everything is being watched all the time, he asks Ike to do something about it, and Ike gets a holiday hashtag going, convincing everyone that if they believe hard enough, PewDiePie will appear. PewDiePie starts reacting to the episode, becoming more popular than Cartman, and making the fat kid disappear as Stan and Kyle finally accept that the world of entertainment has transformed. This two-parter wraps up the 18th season of South Park, a season notable for having a light amount of continuity, something not unheard of in the series, though something never before being a core aspect of the show. We've seen Kenny die for real before, then spend a season dead before coming back. We've seen the kids pretend to be superheroes only to reveal Mysterion was actually immortal, a plot point complete with consequences. We've had celebrities referencing their past appearances in the 200th episode. But the point is that South Park is not a stranger to continuity, but that's never been the point of the show. Until now, when this sort of serialization is the point. So far, though, each episode manages to be a more or less standalone plot. The serialization is more of a nod to the previous story than it is an additional plotline to juggle. Sure, Lord has to deal with the fallout of Stan's actions, but these are just early episode character motivations. The customer support agent is a nod to his earlier appearance, but not the point of the episode. People mention stuff is gluten-free, but again, not a plot point. The question then has to be asked, what was the point of the characterization aside from just winking to the audience? South Park was doing fine without having to tie its plot points together, just being a bunch of random disconnected fun, so why make the shift? Part of this episode's narrative posits that the shift to more serialized storytelling is just a part of a changing media landscape, where the job of the React channel has taken over the role South Park once had of lampooning whatever was popular or in the news at the time. South Park was famous for being able to make an episode in 6 days, but that's a long time compared to a streamer who can post their thoughts on a subject within minutes of it happening. So with that role being taken over by small content creators, South Park has to move in the opposite direction, long-term stories that benefit from binge-watching. The direction that media has to take, else it gets swallowed up by people with less interest in a long-term narrative building on itself. The whole vibe of this season has been one of concern over the growing obsession with the future. Episodes about ongoing events treat things less like they're the targets of ridicule and more like we're the ones being laughed at. Our privacy is invaded by drones. Video games are designed to steal the money from addicts. VR is blending the line between fiction and reality. This one didn't age so well. And new social movements are making us reconsider things as simple as the bathroom. So when the whole world is changing, the people reacting to that world must change as well. Ideally, trying to find some joy in it. Stunning and brave. Victoria Principal is fired for decades worth of allowing the various flavors of bigotry through South Park's history, and she is replaced by PC Principal. He immediately gets to work on fixing South Park by punishing students for various microaggressions towards historically oppressed groups. This includes giving Kyle weeks of detention for not calling Caitlyn Jenner stunning and brave. The other kids encourage Cartman to do something about it, so he tries to frame PC Principal for molesting Butters, only for PC Principal to maim Cartman when he uses anti-Italian language. Meanwhile, PC Principal has found more PC bros in South Park, and they've opened a frat house that throws loud parties that keep the citizens nearby awake. So Randy heads over to tell them to be quiet, only to get caught up in hazing new pledges before becoming PC himself, even checking Kyle's privilege by drawing dicks on his face. Seeing his new friend Kyle get harassed this way, Cartman decides to get revenge against the PC house the only way he knows how, releasing as many stereotypes as he can into the area until Kyle arrives to stop it all, saying it's gone too far, and finally admitting that Caitlyn is a stunning and brave hero. Randy gets credit for the rush, saying that it started a dialogue for people to discuss privilege as PC Principal announces that he's going to stay. Where My Country Gone? Garrison is complaining about the number of immigrants in South Park, all from Canada, and after being forced to take night classes to learn to speak Canadian, he sings the song Where My Country Gone that causes the people of South Park to begin to rally behind him. But his anti-Canadian rhetoric creates a rift between the Canadians and others of South Park, with Cartman deciding one of them must have sex with a Canadian to mend this divide, and they choose Butters. But while Butters is meeting with the family of Charlotte, a Canadian girl, he learns that the Canadians don't actually want to be there. They all left after a man ran for president by shouting outrageous things without offering solutions, only for them to go along with the joke until it was too late to stop. Meanwhile, Garrison has led a group of angry Americans to the American-Canadian border, where they learn the Canadians built the wall to keep Americans out. So Garrison hops Niagara Falls to enter Canada illegally, arriving at a destitute ghost town, save for a single tall building blasting pop music. Upon entering, he sees a figure who is not a stand-in for anyone real, and Garrison keeps to his promise to hot Cosby them to death. Upon returning, Garrison is hailed as a hero, announcing a run for presidency that Kyle tries to argue against, only for people to be mad that he's lecturing them again. The shitty part of town. Seeing all the celebrities making fun of South Park because Garrison's from there, the residents decide they have to improve their image. So they put money into revitalizing the poorest part of the city to look good enough to attract a Whole Foods. Southern downtown South Park, or Soto-Sopa, turns into a vibrant city area, built around and above Kinney's house against the wishes of the McCormick family. Lou Kim, the owner of City Walk, realizes he's losing customers as now he's in the shitty part of town. He decides to hire a bunch of children from displaced residential areas as a child labor force to turn the shitty part of town into Shitty Pot Town. The representative of Whole Foods arrives and begins to inspect the town, getting word from PC Principal that South Park has vastly improved in the short time he's been there. But when the people of South Park see what Lou Kim's been up to, they run over to try to hide him from Whole Foods. But the inspector sees the immigrant children being attacked by white residents and assumes it's a performance of being socially conscious. He approves the Whole Foods as Kinney returns home with his child labor wages, all spent on a gift for his sister. You're not yelping. Local restaurants are giving special treatment to certain customers, allowing them to skip lines and giving them free food, all because these customers call themselves Yelpers, uploading reviews online based on how the restaurant owners sucked up to them. The restaurateurs are afraid of bad reviews, including David, a new kid at South Park Elementary who Cartman bullies into doing his bidding and making stereotypical claims about himself to keep Cartman's review score from going lower. Eventually, the owner of Whistlin' Willie's kicks out all the Yelp reviewers from his store, causing the rest of the restaurateurs to realize they can do the same. Cartman, infuriated that no one is taking him seriously anymore, gathers up all the other reviewers of South Park only to realize that there are thousands of them. He demands they follow their leader, but as each Yelper thinks he's talking about them, they form an angry mob that assaults Willie's. Now that he's being harassed again, David challenges Cartman to a confrontation, though every Yelp reviewer shows up and starts making their case in overlapping conversations. This causes the town to realize the solution to their Yelp reviewer surplus, so they give out a bunch of symbolic medals telling them they're important, as the chefs of South Park all agree to give out the new Yelper Special, to the tune of a song called Boogers and Cum. Safe Space. Cartman comes to PC Principal crying as he's receiving negative comments online about his weight. PC Principal tries to find a student willing to filter through these comments and ends up selecting Butters, who then stays up all night filtering out the negative comments on Cartman's social media pages. This program's a success, so Butters is then assigned to filter out the negative comments on Steven Seagal's accounts after he does an anti-fat shaming speech at the school, and soon Butters is going through dozens of pages to delete all the comments. Meanwhile, Randy keeps having altercations with the clerk at Whole Foods whenever he tries to turn down donating to hungry children. So Randy starts a Shameless America campaign to stop people from being shamed when they don't donate to charity, even creating a charity of his own to raise money to look like he's doing something. But soon, Butters starts hallucinating a man called Reality, telling him off for filtering the comments and causing a psychotic break as Butters runs through the school naked before jumping out a window. Later, at Randy's Shameless America Gala, Reality breaks in to start telling off the celebrities for only pretending to care about their cause, while showing them that Butters has been hospitalized because of their refusal to look at negative comments about them. Realizing they put too much pressure on one kid, the people of South Park start a new charity, to make starving kids across the world filter the negative comments instead. Tweak and Craig. Wendy gives a presentation on Asian American art, including a section dedicated to yaoi, all of which features Tweak and Craig. The rest of the boys are confused, not about the boys being gay, but rather why yaoi artists chose those two specifically. The adults of South Park go out of their way to show off how supportive they are, though when their kids mention yaoi, Randy has no idea what that is, and his calls to the Chinese government don't result in any clear answers. Tired of being singled out, Tweak and Craig start fighting each other before realizing that their fights aren't getting them anywhere. So Craig comes up with the idea to fake a breakup so they'll stop having so much yaoi art made of one another. Though Tweak's acting is too good and Craig looks like the bad guy. With nowhere else to turn, the two give up and pretend to be a couple, if only because that is the path of least resistance. Meanwhile, Cartman's been fighting with Cupid Me because Cupid Me has developed unrequited feelings for him. But when Tweek and Craig break up, Cartman agrees to go on one date with the imaginary Cupid so he'll fix the problem, something Cupid Me does not by making Tweek and Craig fall in love, but by reminding Craig's dad that he loves his son. Naughty Ninjas. When PC Principal calls the police on Leslie, Officer Barbrady is the last to show up, only to accidentally shoot a minority student, getting him fired from his job as the town of South Park starts demanding more accountability from police. Soon, the rest of the police force is forbidden from doing their jobs, as they refuse to work if they can't also beat up minorities. But Kenny, tired of the homeless around Sotosopa and his house, forms a ninja club with his friends, scaring away the homeless and everyone else. But the homeless simply relocate to the Whole Foods, and with no police to beat them up, the citizens of South Park stop shopping there as they no longer feel safe. They try to ask for the police to come back, but the Park County Police Force has been converted into a hula school, refusing to work under the conditions. When the adults see the kids playing ninja and mistakenly think they've joined ISIS, they get scared and track down the newly unemployed Barbrady to shoot the kids. Barbrady arrives at the scene just as Randy rushes over, realizing his mistake and startling Barbrady into shooting the only brown kid of the crowd. In the end, the people of South Park return to their old agreement with the police. They will move the homeless somewhere else, as long as the people look the other way when they assault minorities. Barbrady, meanwhile, is let go from the police force again, only to be recruited to monitor Leslie by an unknown man. Sponsored content. PC Principal is furious about the R slur being printed in the school paper, only to learn the editor who allowed it to go to print was Jimmy Vollmer, and that he can't tell Jimmy that he's wrong to allow it without it coming across as a microaggression. After Jimmy starts spreading the paper around more, he and the other disabled kids of South Park are eventually invited to the PC frat house personally, where Jimmy observes that the PC guys there are only pretending to be socially conscious to have sex with women. Meanwhile, Jimmy is being offered to run sponsored content in his paper in exchange for a lot of money, something Jimmy turns down because he does not want to run ads. Officer Barbrady notices this and saves Jimmy from an ad executive, recruiting him for a project where he is tested on his uncanny ability to recognize real news articles from ads in disguise. Eventually, he's introduced to Leslie from his class, and after a short conversation with her, determines that Leslie doesn't know she's an ad. PC Principal also realizes he might be an ad when one of the other bros discovers his and Leslie's image in a banner. Principal Victoria tracks down Garrison at a presidential debate and tells him he's needed back at South Park for an issue that goes deeper than just her replacement. Truth and advertising. Randy announces that he wants to leave South Park as the changes to the town are pricing the Marsh family out of their home. But he gets kidnapped by Garrison and Victoria when they learn he's PC, with the trio investigating him until they learn of the conspiracy involving the town's new changes, and how it isn't just isolated to South Park. They head to the frat house only to find it abandoned, and when they see what PC Principal was doing before he disappeared, they get distracted by ads and buy ice cream. The boys of South Park also start investigating the disappearance of Leslie and Jimmy, two people that PC Principal had problems with. Super School News reports that they're both on a cruise, but the boys don't trust this, digging further to try and learn the truth, only to get distracted by ads and buy ice cream. Jimmy is wooed by Leslie, who tells him she wants to escape from the newsman running the ad-identifying campaign and needs his help. When they try to get Officer Barbrady to shoot the kids, he refuses and the trio runs away, only to encounter the boys in the newsroom, now being run by Nathan, who's working with the ads. Leslie betrays Jimmy and attacks him before going to Kyle's house, asking for his help and his social security number. PC Principal, Final Justice. Alternate name, Guns Solve Everything. The boys try to meet over what to do regarding the ads invading their space when Kyle tells them they all have to go buy guns. The rest of the town, once armed, starts discussing what's been going on, recapping their stories at gunpoint as Stan finds out that Randy is working with Garrison. Nelson explains his plan to work with the ads to have expensive things to Jimmy. And PC Principal is captured by the US military, only to be released when Leslie spoofs Obama's voice to release him. The anti-ad team learns about an upcoming gun show the entire town will be at, and realizing everyone being in one place at a time is dangerous, they rush over to stop it, including Jimmy arriving after Nathan's expensive prostitute decides she doesn't want her life run by ads. The gun show begins and everyone bursts in, revealing the person who made the joke that cost Principal Victoria her job in the first place was Mackie, tired of being ordered around all the time. He realizes, also at gunpoint, that he should open up more, and the entire town of South Park, still at gunpoint, agrees that they need to be more tolerant of one another or else they might get shot. In the end, PC Principal returns to kill Leslie for being an ad, announcing that he plans on staying in South Park full-time to stop the ads from reaching people's PC. Season 19, Retrospective. Season 18 was the first serialized season of South Park, though this was done somewhat accidentally, as the showrunners were just building on plots to make fun of journalists or referencing older episodes in an attempt to make things seem more connected. Looking back after the season had ended, Matt and Trey realized that there were a lot of things they didn't necessarily do wrong, but could have done better had they attempted to do so from the beginning. Leaning fully into a serialized story could have given them an opportunity to more properly set up these stories, instead of having them appear as coincidence and rolling with it. Season 19 wasn't meant to be a serialized story at first, but when they wrote PC Principal, they liked the character so much, they wanted to bring him back. And in bringing him back, he brought plotlines with him, and soon, they started from episode 1 with the idea of serialization in mind. Of course, with PC Principal becoming a regular member of the main cast, there was bound to be some clashing with the longtime residents of South Park, namely Mr. Garrison, the closeted homophobe turned transphobic lesbian turned anti-everything punchline. When they decided to give Garrison his own plotline this season, they once again pulled from recent headlines. There was a political movement building momentum, one of a political outsider who told people what to be afraid of while promising to solve everything, and a purported lack of knowledge on legal precedent or the mechanics of government were considered a benefit that made him stand out from the other candidates who were more of the same. People who had spent the last 4 or 8 or 19 years doing nothing but complaining were eager to accept someone who would be unlike everything that had come before, as by that point the idea of things not being able to get any worse had been internalized. But things can always get worse, oftentimes by pointing out how things are getting better everywhere else. The people of South Park see an extreme example of the worst parts of their town, and they realize that they really do have to catch up or be associated with the worst kind of people in the world. This is not only something that the characters in the show are realizing, but that Matt and Trey were realizing too. If you take a demographic slice of America, their primary demographic, you will find that it doesn't actually look like South Park looks. Basically, every minority character was a token minority. Their sole Asian man is a white guy with a mental illness yelling stereotypes. And sure, when South Park does representation, they do it really well. I've mentioned how Timmy and Jimmy are some of the most realized characters in the show. But the main characters are 4 white kids in a country where white kids are not 100% of the population. This is not to say that South Park is racist. Well, actually it is, but not because they aren't diverse enough. What it is meant to say is that the show is a relic of an earlier time and has coasted off its popularity from being a show that wasn't afraid to be real, only to then have characters who aren't real. All of this is then compounded by the fact that the show is completely self-aware, not only of the fact that they aren't really small-town America anymore, but that the people who are genuinely ashamed of this tend to be far more concerned with letting everyone know they're ashamed than actually doing anything about it. What gets South Park its Whole Foods is not the diversity of their town, but that the white people are trying really hard to convince everyone they're not racist. This sort of self-righteousness also manifests in other ways. While not quite as related to the plot as so many other points, the Yelp review plague of South Park isn't really about food or even the platform their reviewers use, but their ideas of themselves being far higher than what they actually deserve. There's this idea that just because a person has the ability to speak to an audience, that they also have the authority to speak to an audience. And then the semi-anonymous nature of the internet allows them to be separated enough from their audience to make the importance of their opinions hidden, causing those with big enough egos to believe that it's far higher than the truth. Yes, I am aware of the irony of making this claim 11 hours into a video where I'm just talking about my opinions of a TV show. The difference, or at least my justification, is that the role of a critic is not to be some factual speaker on whether a person should or should not engage with the work, be it a dish at a restaurant or a long-running TV show, but to help the audience to better engage with that work if they do watch or rewatch it later, to turn the audience into critics themselves, so they can better create their own idea of the themes and narrative devices by having an opinion told to them and then deciding for themselves whether they agree or disagree, and ideally having the knowledge base to justify that opinion. So the Yelp reviewers in this episode might deserve to eat boogers and cum because they act like they deserve better food than the people they're critics for, while a real critic acts like the people they are critics for are the ones who deserve better. In keeping with this theme of egos, Cartman, as usual, manages to take advantage of the changes to South Park as quickly as anyone else. He uses the new changes designed to sanitize the town to sanitize everything around him. And as Cartman is a horrible person, he tends to attract the same sort of behavior he exhibits reflected back at him. In deleting comments and ideas we dislike, we can hide from ourselves the fact that these comments are not too different from what we exhibit. When negative comments are filtered out, it's because some people are afraid that these comments might be accurate, not in what they're saying, but in how they feel. But is that so bad? After all, not liking the parts of yourself that are the most toxic is a good trait to have, recognizing that there's no point in trying to engage with that part of your brain, even if someone else is doing it, can be a step towards positive change. Like with Yelp reviews, just because a person has an opinion does not mean they're entitled to making other people read it. Sometimes a safe space is a space full of the people who you actually care about, and especially with the way algorithms try to push hate speech and negativity to increase engagement, a safe space really can just be any space where you get to curate what you see and who you see. The only issue is trying to force the emotional labor onto other people, and not just the people who act like Cartman all the time. Of course, one of the fundamental facts about reality is that for as much as we like to curate what comes into our little spheres, we have far less control about what comes out. In the case of Tweek and Craig, what comes out of the new Asian American student body is a series of yaoi images of the couple, which were based on real fan art that Matt and Trey kept finding themselves exposed to. The reactions the school kids have to this art mirrors the real-life reactions of the showrunners, namely, why, and who is this for? You can control the message of your media, but you can't control people's reactions to that message, just as much as you can't control the reactions people have to images of yourself you put online, nor can you really be honest with yourself if you don't acknowledge that those comments exist. South Park was never meant to attract yaoi fangirls. It was never meant to gain an audience who cared about chipping, but that doesn't matter because it did. Through the episode Tweek x Craig, there are several attempts to try and parse what's happening without coming across as homophobic or against the union out of a sense of fear. This is an uphill battle, as South Park has a reputation of being profane and very homophobic. But this is a season all about change, and one of those changes is being less bigoted than before. Even if it was done in a facetious manner in earlier episodes, the fact of the matter is it was still done, and audiences will interpret things that happen in your work in a way you may have never intended for them to do so. In the end, accepting Craig and Tweek or the yaoi artist or whatever other demographic appears in the new South Park is less about understanding what's going on and more about not judging what's going on, especially when you can acknowledge that you don't understand it. Another of the big changes in this season of South Park, one of those progressive ideas the city folk promote, is the idea of reducing the role of the police force in their society. This is one of those liberal ideas with a good concept and terrible branding, where the idea is to redirect funds for general police work to instead create a lesser form of police force in charge of situations where there's no direct danger but still a need for policing, like moving the homeless away from the front of a business or responding to a mental health crisis or a domestic dispute. When the same guy you have in charge of responding to Leslie talking too much is also the guy you call to get into a shootout with ISIS, then of course you'll wind up with people who treat both of these missions with the same severity. Shoot first, call anyone who asks questions a communist later. But the real implementation of these ideas in South Park has just as much to do with the characters as the real-world equivalent. Officer Barbrady, like so much else in South Park, is a product of his time. The bumbling cop archetype is something a lot more common in the 90s, but a thing that people have stopped using today. South Park itself even stopped using him as a character prior to this season, with his role mostly being taken over by the Park County Police Force and Sergeant Yates. Art reflects life, and the classic idea of a police officer is more of a member of the community you can talk to than a faceless, masked entity who exists to exert control over you. Speaking of faceless entities, the entire major conflict of this season is not so much that South Park is becoming more sanitized, both the show and town, but rather the reason it's becoming more sanitized in the first place. This is the same reason as always. Networks want to run ads. If the show is abrasive, the ad space next to the content is less valuable, the same way a billboard is less valuable in the bad part of town. In fact, a majority of censorship is not done out of a hatred of free speech, but because it's hurting someone's bottom line somewhere. Human rights and profit have always been at odds with one another. I actually did the math myself at one point, calculating the view count, view time, and typical space between ad breaks in my videos to figure out how much I should be making versus how much I am making. I came to the shocking conclusion that about 17% of my viewers have ad blockers or some other means of circumventing ads on my channel. That seems really low. With Firefox and uBlock Origin, you can actually get a pretty consistent ad-free experience out of YouTube, and I'm kind of surprised more people don't do this. I definitely recommend this to anyone who finds the ads too intrusive. You should not have to suffer interruptions if you don't want to. Anyway, the comparison is made between advertiser-friendly speech and gentrification, that to block offensive language is just gentrifying it. The thing about raising property values and consolidating wealth with no concern for who it's going to is that it's a bit like raising a water level. The people closest to the poverty line will sink first, but everyone else is still endangered too. The water level only stops rising when the people who are rising the water level don't care about making more money anymore. Under a capitalist system, that will never happen. Sure, when it was only Kenny's house getting built over, people were fine with it because they considered that an acceptable loss to have slightly nicer things. And when the problem spread further and more homeless people started to build camps around South Park, most of the citizens still believed it was worthwhile, at least until the homeless started sleeping in places where they could see them. But the solution was still easy. Just have the police brutalize the parts of society that got left behind by the rising cost of living. But once the average person started to get priced out, they suddenly realized that you can't beat your problems until they're not visible. It isn't until the threat of homelessness and pricing out starts to affect an average person that they stop considering homelessness and poverty as a moral failing deserving of brutality. This then ties back into the language gentrification lesson from before. At some point, even the most socially conscious person will wind up saying something that hurts someone in some way. There has to be a line drawn to allow for differences in opinion and a flexibility in what people are willing to accept, not only saying it but hearing it. At the end of the day, a person can still use all the right, politically correct language they want to while still being exclusionary and divisive, whereas another person can refer to a group as a slur in the same sentence they argue for equality and civility. The actual language matters far less than the intent of the sentence and the context in which it's said. All of these conflicts then wrap up when people begin carrying guns everywhere. Matt and Trey are very outspoken libertarians, so the guns in this episode aren't just metaphorical and likely meant to be actual firearms. But the message of each character being armed is still maintained. When Cartman initially tries to blackmail PC Principal to get him out of the school, PC Principal maintains his argument by beating up Cartman. The PC Bros repeatedly use the threat of violence to get their way, even if they pretend otherwise. Ideologically, one could simply tell them that using violence as enforcement is an idea derived from colonization, that might makes right and the groups who have been victimized in the past just weren't strong enough to be worth keeping. But this whole season was never about ideology, but the way in which it's forced onto other people. If you start telling other people what to think, then according to the narrative, you are in the wrong. It doesn't matter if your grand speech at the end of the episode was something people needed to hear. Some folks are just tired of being expected to do anything differently than they already are. Member berries. All of South Park is attending a girls' volleyball game, not because they want to watch it, but because they want to see how many of the girls will sit down during the national anthem, a protest caused by the online trolling done by an anonymous person named SkankHunt42. In light of more protesting during this anthem, the US government asked J.J. Abrams to reboot the anthem so nobody will want to protest during it, demanding he share his member berries with the world. Garrison is on the campaign trail, gaining more and more momentum from the polls before stopping to realize he has no real policies and doesn't actually want to be president because he'll look like a jackass if he wins. So he tries to sabotage his presidential chances by sitting during the new national anthem. Meanwhile, Cartman is pretending he's been assaulted by the girls as he anticipates a gender war between the two sexes that he wants to be on the right side of. More and more people are being suggested member berries to take the edge off, a clump of berries who speaks in a high-pitched voice about things from the past, and also occasionally spouting a right-wing talking point. The new national anthem is revealed, and it starts by inviting people to sit, kneel, or stand, making any protests irrelevant and ruining Garrison's ability to protest. In the end, Kyle vows to discover the identity of Skank Hunt 42, only for the camera to reveal it's his father, Gerald. Skank Hunt. After more online abuse, Heidi heads to the local bridge and throws her phone off, quitting social media for good. The rest of the school treats this as a suicide, mourning her absence from online spaces, while the rest of the boys realize that the girls are planning something big soon. So they take matters into their own hands and lure Cartman into the woods with promises of counterstrike, only to lock the door behind him and take all of Cartman's electronics, smashing them up as he begs them to stop. But the next morning, after Gerald was called out by Freya Oligard, a Dutch Olympian who runs a charity, he ramps up his attacks on her until he makes the news, with the boys realizing they smashed Cartman's devices for no reason. The girls of South Park Elementary then reveal their attack on the boys, breaking up with all of them at once and leaving all the boys single. As this is going on, Counselor Mackey grows increasingly tired of convincing Scott Malkinson not to delete his social media accounts. The Damned. Gerald continues trolling Freya during an appearance on a talk show, though he panics when some police officers come to his house, relieved that they're just there to ask Kyle about Cartman's disappearance from the online world. This causes Kyle to address the other boys regarding what they did, worried that Cartman might soon come clean that they destroyed his phone. At a presidential debate, the giant douche comes out and says he would be a terrible president as he has no idea what he's doing, though as per her prepping from her advisors, the turd sandwich repeatedly calls him a liar. This only makes him look better, and it makes the people watching the debate feel more sympathetic towards the douche as he says what they're feeling. Randy panics as he realizes that people keep flipping opinions and searches for some meaning to this, connecting the member berries to everyone's polarization. Gerald learns that Freya has committed suicide due to the harassment from copycat trolls and panics about what he caused, culminating in an anonymous note left on his car saying they know who he is. He destroys all his devices only to receive an email on Ike's computer demanding a face-to-face meeting. Cartman is called out by Heidi as she invites him to chat in person, no devices anywhere. The two meet at the park with all the others who have quit social media, slowly coming to like each other more and more. Wieners out. Gerald meets with the person writing him the anonymous letters, discovering it's a fellow troll asking to work together. He tries avoiding this troll for a while, but his attempts to avoid online interactions all fail as he eventually relapses into trolling in his bathroom with an uncomfortable cover story. In the end, Gerald meets with this troll where he learns that the Danish government has funded an operation to track down the real identities of every troll post made online, meaning that his actions will soon be exposed. So Gerald follows this new troll to a headquarters where all the other internet trolls are planning a counterattack. Back at South Park Elementary, Kyle tries to mend the growing gap between the male and female students by attending a volleyball game, but Butters gets angry, saying that he shouldn't be blamed for one troll's actions, and he pulls down his pants in a Wieners Out protest. PC Principal refuses to do anything about this protest as he doesn't want to body shame or come across as a hypocrite for allowing one and not the other. So Kyle tracks down Cartman to ask him to do something about Butters, but Cartman is now dating Heidi and no longer cares about things like that anymore, assuming Kyle just wants to break them apart. With no help from him, Kyle decides to join in with the rest of the boys in Butters' Wieners Out protest. Douche and a Danish. Heidi and Eric step in between a conflict of the boys and the girls of South Park, hoping to stop the infighting by focusing on a greater conflict, raising money for the Danish troll-catching project with a bake sale. Gerald and the other trolls identify the best way to troll the Danish government by having other people do the work for them and simply stoking arguments. They launch a trolling attack on Denmark, accusing their businesses of working with terrorists and causing public opinion to turn against the country. This ruins the South Park fundraiser, which Butters blames on the girls and the girls blame on the boys, leading Cartman and Heidi to try to find out what's really going on. The giant douche is down in the polls doing the opposite of what his advisors say by attacking women with sexist remarks on stage. When his supporters wonder why he's throwing the election, the douche says that the system is rigged anyway, though, uncharacteristically, his supporters don't believe him and they chase him down to South Park. Garrison tries to pretend he's still a teacher there, but gets dragged away by his campaign staffers, eventually winding up in a support group for memberberry addiction, where Randy links the rise of memberberries to decadent societies. Fort Collins. The trolls from before are trying to get Gerald involved in another mass trolling event after their last attack caused Denmark to go silent. But he just wants to go back to trolling for fun, rather than activism as the other trolls claim they're trolling for. Cartman and Heidi approach Kyle, asking if he is still interested in finding out who SkankHunt42 is, and revealing Heidi has been doing emoji analysis to narrow it down to one of the South Park parents, sharing this method with the Danish to help them put the final touches on their troll detecting service. They launch a beta test of this technology, revealing the messages of every single person in Fort Collins, Colorado, and causing chaos in the streets, including the father of a disabled girl lighting one of the main trolls on fire. Cartman realizes that his entire past will soon be made public and panics, failing to lie to Heidi about the fact that he didn't like the Ghostbusters reboot and worrying about the future of their relationship. Unable to destroy the memberberries, Randy convinces the giant douche to speak frankly without making the conversation about him, and imploring people to admit that the new Star Wars wasn't that great. The memberberries sacrifice one of their own to the giant douche's running mate. Oh geez. The election results come in, and the giant douche has won, much to the surprise of everyone, especially Garrison himself. The government comes for Gerald, taking him away from his family, only to reveal they want him to infiltrate the Danish government to take out their troll trace technology with an EMP. He is sent to Denmark with a fake identity, and Gerald revels in being a secret agent, until he's finally taken to the server room, where the rest of the trolls reveal they all fell for the same trick. The EMP briefcases all open at once, and the group is rickrolled. Bill Clinton and Bill Cosby visit South Park Elementary to try to mend the gap between the boys and girls, inviting some of the boys to a gentleman's club, where they learn to change to appease the woman. When Clinton visits the grounded Butters, he tells the boy that something big is coming from all the pissed-off women and that he should start getting used to sucking up or he'll suffer too. Cartman, afraid of Troll Trace revealing everyone's info, takes Heidi to SpaceX as he hopes that on Mars there will be no Wi-Fi. Members only. Garrison gets a new transformation, becoming more presidential as he returns to South Park and starts demanding oral sex from everyone he sees. But he gets soon called into the Pentagon, where he's warned by his advisors the Danish have not accepted the trolls given to them by the previous administration as enough, and are threatening to unveil Troll Trace anyway, with every country gearing up for a global war in anticipation of their internet history being unveiled. Cartman, Heidi, and Butters enter SpaceX, only for Elon Musk to give them an underwhelming tour and saying that he's still 10 years away from landing on Mars. Gerald calls Ike, telling him to post on the school forums as SkankHunt42 to try to deflect blame away from himself, resulting in Ike getting grounded. Though Kyle's able to piece together from all of this that Gerald was the real instigator of everything that's gone on, and he rushes out of the house with his brother. The memberberries enter the White House in massive numbers, calling up various world leaders and talking to them about nostalgic things like the Cold War and World War II. Not funny. Sergeant Yates implores the people of South Park not to panic, as the Troll Trace program doesn't work if people refuse to use it, meaning that if everyone acts dignified, they can avoid a disaster. Knowing that will never happen, everyone falls into a panicked state. So they try to manipulate Mr. Garrison into nuking Denmark by having Mr. Slave call him and saying that he's a wuss who will never do it. So Garrison launches all his missiles. Kyle and Ike celebrate the end of Troll Trace before learning their father's in Denmark at the moment and will get hit by the missiles. So they call Garrison and tell him he's weak and easy to manipulate, making him call off the strike. Butters is now talking about Heidi, who has been put in charge of fixing SpaceX's failures to launch. Cartman assumes Butters' change of heart is an attempt to win over his girlfriend, but Butters says it's because he thinks all men are going to be rendered obsolete soon. Heidi is actually able to use emoji analysis to substitute the mathematical symbols with emojis and figure out what has to change, then succeeds in jump-starting the Mars program. Back in Denmark, the head of Troll Trace talks down to Gerald, not for being a troll, but for being a bad one. He reveals his scheme all along was to pretend to be Danish and then control the country by turning everyone against each other with his program. Then he traps all the employees in a room adjacent to the trolls and rickrolls everybody. The end of serialization as we know it. Kyle comes up with a plan to overload the servers of Troll Trace by spreading so much hate that the entire thing is destroyed. He works together with the captive trolls in Denmark and Gerald, who has to shut off a series of breakers to ensure the power surge happens, though he gets stopped by the CEO of Troll Trace in a scene reminiscent of the new Star Wars. While at a standoff, the CEO tries to convince Gerald there's no difference between the two of them. Butters convinces Cartman that the women of the Mars mission are actually going to make men irrelevant once they arrive, forcing them to write jokes in underground cum mines. So Cartman secretly turns against Heidi as he gets a message from Kyle, asking him to hook up the new power supply she's created to the internet to help overload it. Sheila tries to stop her sons from using the computer after grounding Ike for being Skankhunt 42 and grounding Kyle for taking his side. She rushes into the streets to look for them, only to discover about the Troll Trace servers, looking up Ike's history to find he's actually completely innocent. But before she can look up Gerald's history, Gerald kicks the Troll Trace CEO in the balls, pushing him off a walkway and pulling the final breaker. The internet breaks and everything is reset to begin again. The new internet starts back up, with people making the same crude comments towards each other as always. Season 20 Wrap-Up. The key word for this season is provocateur, a term defined by Matt and Trey as a person who intentionally makes inflammatory comments and picks fights for no reason other than that they want attention. Sometimes these people are called trolls, sometimes they're called muckrakers, but everyone can eventually recognize the person who always chimes in to innocent conversations with an actually, or one who loves correcting people even if they're actually correct. South Park has already chronicled the rise of the professional provocateur, whether it's by having Cartman gain traction for a talk show by claiming Wendy was killing Smurfs, or it was just the boys starting a new show where they made up stuff to attract a terrified audience. At one point, the trolls of the world used to be reclusive, staying in basements and never acting out in public. Their anger was something they expressed in private as they knew in the back of their minds it was wrong. And sure, at first it's justified as being funny to whoever's posting it, but if you pretend to be an idiot for long enough, you'll soon find yourself in the company of actual idiots who believe they're with their own kind. Then, hoping to fit in with your new friends, you start to internalize this idiocy, and then start trying to one-up the others. And of course, idiocy in this instance is referring to misogyny or racism or any other sort of prejudice. The rise of this professional provocateur does not come as a surprise in a world where attention is as commodified and in high demand as it is today. These days, the most valuable resource is attention, and getting people to listen to a sales pitch is a larger industry than whatever is being pitched. So how do you get more engagement? Easy. Anger. Negative emotions get people to engage with you far more effectively than positive ones. If I wanted more people to watch this video, I could have made the title and thumbnail something along the lines of "Why South Park Sucks Now," or "The Decline and Fall of South Park," or "South Park Was Never Good." But that's dishonest. It's profitable, but it's dishonest. So now the provocateur has found his way into the mainstream, going from the role of internet troll to the more mainstream cultural grifter, the type who creates a channel online with the intention of making everything into some sort of ideological struggle. If you didn't like a recent movie, you are a sexist. If you don't like a certain video game, you're a cuckold. If you don't like a specific band, you're a beta male. Everything becomes an us versus them sort of conflict, where taste is now an ideological concept rather than personal affliction. Of course, it's easy to convince people that some new movie has an ideology behind it that they have to get behind in an us versus them conflict, But what's not so easy is taking something old and beloved and convincing people it was never good, even if that is true. Nostalgia is a powerful force, more powerful than common sense, and people can be nostalgic even for things that are objectively terrible. People who want to go back to the good old days often have very selective memories of what was so good about them. The aughts were a time of escalating global conflicts and severe paranoia. The 80s had the Cold War, where people weren't sure if they'd live to be adults or die in a nuclear hellfire. The 60s saw revolutions and civil rights as people were now treated as equal regardless of skin color, at least based on legal rulings. The memberberries even wax nostalgic about stormtroopers, and not the ones from Star Wars, as they try to convince people about the good old days when guys like that were in power. The world has been steadily progressing towards one where power is less consolidated by a handful of ultra-rich landed elite. People living today are more likely to have basic civil rights that were not afforded to them before. This nostalgia works both ways, though. As much as it praises the old times while ignoring all the conflicts and issues of that era, it also depends on naysaying about modern society. Watching the news today, you only see doom and gloom with a prevailing idea that the world is extremely dangerous, and nothing has ever been worse. The crime rate across the entire developed world has been on a steady decline for half a century, but you wouldn't know that watching television. What you would know from watching TV is that things back in the old days were never violent, instead of the truth that there was just less sensationalism about more frequent crimes. Bad news spreads faster than good news, but it tends to have less staying power in people's memories. The end result of this is that we always think of the present as far worse than it is, while we think of the past as being better. Decades ago, everything was perfect. Today, it's flawed. The conclusion you must draw is that everything is getting worse. So when the objective reality is that more people have it better, there's a corollary truth that a few people have it worse. Inequality is not just one group having it worse, but another having it better at their expense. Once these systems are dismantled, the folks who had it easy now have it the same as everyone else, and they like to lash out against the people who had it hard by downplaying other people's struggles and exaggerating their own, to make it look as though equality is injustice. This is the psychology of the professional victim, a type of provocateur who hates the world of progress and tries to act as though all changes are always for the worse. They used to walk into a business and get a job with a firm handshake, but the truth was that it had less to do with the firmness of their handshake than the tone of their skin and what was in their pants. So they criticize merit-based societies as being unfair, since they never had to be talented to be successful before. This clashes with last season's Forces, where people tried to push for equality in the interest of reaching a wider audience, making the more exclusive audience once more resent that they're not the center of attention any longer. Trolls used to be basement dwellers. They used to be the outcasts and misfits of society, blaming their problems vaguely on the fact that we live in a society, and ignoring all the well-adjusted folks who have the same conditions as them. These people were never successful, but rather than acknowledging shortcomings, they look for someone else to blame. They look for someone to tell them who else to blame. This burgeoning demographic was prime for creating the show's mentioned Trevor's axiom: stoke the flames of a person's insecurities and bring those out, then have people's responses to their entitlement make it appear as though their victim complex is being justified. Trolls used to be basement dwellers, but now trolls are guys in suits with real lives, taking advantage of the rage of the nerds underneath them to do their bidding. Anger is infectious, and they had to find a patient zero. They found the troll. But who is they? I vaguely alluded to this group of people who love to complain about how bad everything is, and who constantly idealize a past that, for most people, never existed. The type of person who's negative all the time to the point of it being their entire brand, the reason they exist in the popular consciousness, instead of shouting into the void over nothing. A quick Control F will show that I have not said his name once, but it's abundantly obvious from the start of this season that Matt and Trey assumed that Trump would lose the 2016 election, and they based the whole season off of that. Then he won, and they had to change everything suddenly as their old plot about memberberries no longer made sense with Garrison at the helm. Their justification for this was that, as always, they looked at Vegas odds over the presidential election, assuming that people with unbiased money on the line were the ideal source to look for accuracy. The duo behind South Park are very outspoken libertarians. This means that above all else they loathe large government, and they dislike what most people agree is the major contributing factor to almost every problem in modern Western governments: money in politics. For so long, politicians have not been people with a vested interest in improving their country or other people's lives, but people who just want to get rich by defrauding their voter base. The fact that a political outsider was gaining so much momentum was a sign that the line between business and politics was not so much blurred as completely erased. CEOs no longer needed to buy off politicians, they could just run themselves. But it's not just that Matt and Trey hated Trump because he was a sign of the decaying of American political decency, but worse, he was one of them. A professional provocateur. They were no better than the trolls they wanted to denounce. They were no better than a corrupt business executive stoking the flames of the internet to get people mad enough to vote against their own self-interest. Matt and Trey were pro-Trump. They have always been pro-Trump. They were the MAGA movement 20 years before the MAGA movement began. This is evident looking back at almost any political take they've ever made, and I have chronicled this consistent part of their ideology through this entire video. When made to choose a side in the climate change debate, they had the choice between the turd sandwich hippies trying to save the planet and the giant douche CEOs destroying it. And they sided with the douches because the turds were annoying. They sided with big tobacco over anti-smoking campaigns because the anti-smoking campaigns were annoying and the guys trying to kill them told it like it is. They sided with the construction companies raising the rainforest because they thought hippies were annoying. They have always sided with whatever side is funnier and asked them to do the least. So when a presidential election happens between somebody who's a little bit annoying and someone who wants to use the highest power in the country to enrich himself at the expense of terrified masses, of course they would side with the Trump movement. That's the side they have always taken their entire careers. This season served as a wake-up call for the duo. Not merely that they were choosing the side of the professional complainers of the world, the type to invent problems and then scare people into thinking that only they knew the solution, but also a wake-up call in the sense that they were not quite as good at predicting the future as they believed themselves to be. To make a show that depends so heavily on recent political changes and then get it wrong, meaning that they're back to their panicked 6-day turnover state, except now they have a plot thread they have to address and can't experiment or start over. All the while coping with the fact that the events unfolding around them are all a result of the personalities they've prided themselves on for so many decades. So this crisis is a crisis of faith, not so much in the political system, they've never believed in that, but in themselves. What is the key difference between provocateurs like South Park and provocateurs like Trump? The key difference is a concept that the duo has brought up in the past, an idea from decades ago called punk rock. South Park Studios justifies its past mistakes and bad takes by arguing that they are punk rock. The show takes 6 days to make, and as a result, it's a very raw and reactive show. It's rough around the edges, but in a way that only adds to the authenticity. That authenticity is what legitimizes the show compared to a talk show host who screams about pronouns and then says all the solutions to your problems is some sort of government-run camp. Effectively, the difference between a good and bad faith actor is not about presentation or even whether the trolling is funny or not, but rather who the victim of the trolling is. South Park is legitimate satire because they try to punch up at larger sources of power who try and drag them down. Sure, they haven't always done this, and Gerald's conversations with the other trolls speaks to a bit of self-awareness about this fact, but this season's end is effectively a declaration that they'll be better in the future. Making fun of disabled kids or the impoverished or immigrants or those with little power in society is called punching down, and it's not funny. Making fun of the most powerful man in the world is always acceptable because you're always punching up. White people renovating houses. Randy and Sharon have a new TV show, White People Renovating Houses, where they mostly tear down walls in people's living rooms to open the design, though their filming is constantly interrupted by angry white mobs protesting through the streets. These mobs are upset about Alexa taking their jobs, and their chants and Confederate flags are making white people look bad, hurting Randy's new show. Meanwhile, Cartman is growing increasingly upset by Heidi trying to get his attention, as he is now obsessed with Alexa because it does whatever he tells it to. But after justifying his separation from Heidi as a result of her abuse, he's shocked to find out that all the home assistants are now gone, replaced by the Turker Jerb types, as part of an agreement to get them work again. But Daryl is upset with how degrading the work of a home assistant is, and he quits, with Randy lecturing him about what work means and that careers are different now. But the real reason Daryl hasn't opened up is because the walls in his house are load-bearing and he can't renovate his home. So Randy renovates Daryl's house by redoing the entire interior, creating enough space for all the Confederate flag-waving protesters to celebrate. Meanwhile, Cartman finds an alleyway full of the abandoned home assistants and adopts all of them, breaking up with Heidi because he now has obedient robots. Repeatedly brought up throughout this episode is a metaphor about renovating houses being similar to renovating America, to repair the growing political divides as the country moved into a new era in hope that everything could return to normal. But this is something that's hard to do, as the foundation of Daryl's house is too much a part of the existing system to simply ignore. This works on a few levels, not merely the fact that, for some of their beliefs are so ingrained into who they are, they cannot give up those beliefs without being someone else, but the fact that this intolerance goes far deeper into the roots of the country. Our founding fathers all owned slaves. Most of the land was taken by genociding the people there first, and a good chunk of our wars were done less in the interest of spreading democracy and more for financial means. So tearing down walls in the country doesn't work if the country itself is built on this sort of divisiveness. And this metaphor is intentionally ignored by Randy the entire time because he's far more concerned with making sure he looks good rather than actually connecting with the people he's supposed to help. As for those people, they represent a part of South Park that has irreversibly changed. The fact that the show's notoriety as satire is something they can no longer do. Back in Season 8, Cartman led a group of citizens in a march where they shouted, "Wir müssen die Juden ausrotten," something that was meant to be an extreme example of his ideology, but something that is now just sort of something that occurs in real life. So what was once considered boundary-pushing satire is now tame by the standards of reality, meaning that the sweet spot where believability and realism overlapped is now gone. Put it down. Tweek is panicking over tensions with North Korea, and the fact that Garrison keeps tweeting threats to the country, escalating everything. So Craig asks him to bake cupcakes for Kim Jong-un, which temporarily eases these tensions, until Garrison gets jealous of the attention and begins to taunt the North Koreans into attacking Tweek, with the country even launching a missile over Tweek's house. Cartman's back together with Heidi after breaking up last episode because he threatened suicide if she didn't take him back, and all the other boys make fun of him for it. Cartman tries to start a suicide awareness event, though he's competing against a campaign to stop distracted driving, which has claimed a few students' lives as people are distracted reading Garrison's tweets. After more and more students are killed, Cartman starts escalating his campaign until eventually Heidi tries to stop him from interrupting others' mourning. This speech inspires Craig to return to the panicking Tweek and finally acknowledging his anxiety, talking through it until he finally comes up with a solution to the real problem. Tweek and Craig perform a song together, reminding people not to text while being president. Seeing that he's still not getting attention, Cartman changes his mind. Tweek and Craig, still a couple from last season, but more in a platonic sense, spend most of this episode feuding with each other due to not knowing why the other one is either so panicked or so calm. Craig doesn't get why Tweek is so worried over something he has no ability to change or fix, but Tweek doesn't get why Craig is trying to apply logic to the actions of Garrison, more concerned with his ego than people's lives. The narrative starts out by portraying Craig as being in the right, but as the episode goes on and things escalate with more and more people getting run over, it's clear that the cold logic of Craig just means letting kids continue to die while acting like worrying about that is illogical. Because acting like you're in control of your emotions when in reality you're just ignoring them doesn't mean you are in control of your emotions. It means you're afraid of them and won't get anything done, because you devote more energy into fleeing than to fighting. Both logic and emotion have their place in a relationship, in anything for that matter, and it's not until people start using both that there's an acknowledgement that, yeah, people probably should be freaking out over the president picking fights with nuclear powers for no reason, even if, realistically, nothing will come of it. Holiday Special. The kids of South Park Elementary are furious because Randy Marsh has convinced the school board to remove Columbus Day as a holiday, meaning they have to go to school on Monday. While trying to figure out how to get their day off back, the kids discover a series of images of Randy dressed as Columbus, and when he's confronted about these, he looks for a way to prove he's a victim and discovers DNA testing. Randy pays an indigenous man to allow him to open-mouth kiss him so his cheek swab will make him look less white. But this man soon develops feelings for Randy, returning again and again. The kids try to kidnap the man on the calendar board to prove to him that Randy is racist, using some footage of him trying to kick that indigenous man out of his house while carrying all his Columbus memorabilia to prove the point. The DNA testing crew, after redoing the test without foreign spit in Randy's mouth, reveals to Randy that he is completely Caucasian, but that he also has some Neanderthal DNA in him, which he uses to fuel his victim complex until he's finally confronted by the rest of the plot lines. This includes the indigenous man he's been blowing off, who finally tells Randy to stop fighting his feelings and prompting him to bring back the 3-day weekend by calling the new holiday Indigenous Peoples Day, because he doesn't know what the word means. In 1492, Columbus got us a day off school. He also did a lot of other stuff on his return voyages, most of which would get the ICC called on him if it existed in that time, but no one really knows him for that. In fact, the actual knowledge around Columbus and his adventures in the New World are the source of a weird amount of contention from both sides, as they make an argument that has far less to do with facts and more to do with feelings. The truth is that Columbus didn't contribute 100% to the transatlantic slave trade. He is not responsible personally for any genocide, but he serves as a symbol for those who followed him with less savory intentions. Because acknowledging a wide-reaching system of inequality that existed for centuries after the man died and still has ramifications in modern society is hard. But pointing a finger at someone and shouting racist is easy. The fact of the matter is that Randy is an exaggeration of a person in this conversation, while Cartman and the other kids are not. Nobody really celebrated Columbus Day. There are no Columbus Day feasts, no big parades, people don't call up their family to have a big October barbecue. Maybe there are some hardcore Italians who celebrate it, but anyway, Columbus Day is a day off work. Changing the name to Indignant Peoples Day doesn't affect anyone's celebration of staying home and wondering how they're going to do 5 days of work in 4. The only reason people are defending Columbus Day is because someone went after it and they are opposed to change. The only reason people are going after Columbus Day is because someone was making its defense a part of their personality. This is the definition of a culture war, where the objectives are vague and the conflict matters far less than who's fighting it. Franchise prequel. Jimmy, as the hero Fastpass, successfully joins Coon and Friends in anticipation of their new superhero franchise on Netflix, which is approving just about everyone. But before they can get their movies released, Professor Chaos strikes by spreading misinformation about the supergroup on Facebook. The parents of South Park are worried about what their kids are doing, as they believe the stuff Professor Chaos has posted online, so they invite Mark Zuckerberg to South Park to speak about online safety. Though he shows up and, poorly dubbed, starts bragging about his stoil and how he's unblockable. This unblockable Zuckerberg starts entering people's homes and following them around, refusing to leave, all while the kids worry that they'll never get their own Netflix series with the allegations. So they fake fight Zuckerberg as he's walking through town, with Cartman lamenting after their loss that the man is beating them up for their beliefs, revealing the whole thing was streamed to Facebook Live. In light of these kids spreading their own misinformation, Zuckerberg stops protecting Butters, and soon his father arrives to not only ground Butters, but the man that he learned the behavior from, Vladimir Putin. South Park has already had a Facebook episode a few seasons back, but that was then and this is now, where the cultural idea of the site has changed from a place where people overshare things that happened to them, to a place where people overshare things that didn't happen to anyone. There was this idea that was intrinsic to social media. You were surrounded by your friends and acquaintances, and the whole site was effectively a forum for people to get together. But this forum was slowly invaded by outside actors until eventually it was a place to advertise like everything else. Not solely products, but the more valuable thing, ideas. And because it's social media, it has a greater sense of legitimacy than something as blatant as a billboard, or a commercial break on TV, or this ad break. And I hope an ad actually played during that silence, otherwise that joke wouldn't have worked. Now, this is not a change that happened accidentally, but one that was completely intentional. Being able to reach people in such a targeted fashion was an extremely lucrative concept, and where there's money to be made, there will be money made, no matter how bad of an idea it is. This misinformation makes money. It makes more money than real information. You cannot put a price on a precious family memory nearly as easily as you can put a price on Russian state propaganda. So of course people seeking a paycheck are going to side with literal supervillains over their average user, because when a product is offered to you for free, you are the product. Hummels and heroin. Charles Entertainment Cheese overdoses during Marcus Preston's birthday party, and he vows to get to the bottom of the epidemic of famous celebrity mascots overdosing on illegally obtained opioids. He goes to the coroner's office where he discovers Hummels, those little German mascots, on the person of many of the deceased. This leads him to Stan, who's found himself in the middle of a drug smuggling ring as elderly folks in the nursing home are smuggling out their prescription medication in exchange for these statues. Also, they can have the largest collection, which will put them in charge. But Stan wants nothing to do with these drug deals, so he comes up with a plan alongside the other boys to distract the old folks while they rob the head bitch in charge of the nursing home. After convincing Marcus Peterson to assist him in the heist, they're able to give all the Hummels to Stan's grandpa, and he proceeds to beat Miss McGillicuddy until she's thrown into solitary confinement, as Marcus Peterson goes to the healthcare providers convention for more interrogations. South Park takes on the opioid crisis to figure out who keeps killing beloved performers like Peppa Pig and Swiper the Fox. Of course, instead of pointing their fingers at the usual suspects, whichever demographic scares old people the most, they instead make jokes about what it would be like if it were the old folks themselves. Retirement homes are basically prisons anyway, where people who have committed the crime of being old are sentenced. Of course, like most people involved in these trades, they're just doing what's available to them. Once you're in jail, you're branded criminal, so you become a criminal because that's now the most lucrative way to live. But as you go further and further down the rabbit hole, from the people overdosing to the people selling the drugs, you find the suppliers, and, to the surprise of no one, the real suppliers were not shady folks in shady places, but the pharmaceutical representatives pushing product for profit. And this time, they don't have any sort of societal factor to explain away their rise to crime. Sons of Witches. The dads of South Park are having their Jack and Crack week, where they dress as witches in the days leading up to Halloween and get wasted. But one man, Chip Duncan, brings a real spellbook and transforms into a witch, flying around South Park and terrorizing the pumpkin patch while kidnapping children. At this pumpkin patch are Cartman and Heidi, who missed most of the events as Heidi spent too long getting ready. So Cartman plots to lure Heidi into the woods to abandon her, letting the witch snatch his girlfriend so he doesn't have to break up with her. The other boys have an actual plan to get rid of the witch, calling a former member of the Witches' Club, Garrison, to come down and handle the problem. But the witches of South Park are tired of the persecution just because one of theirs went out and started to kidnap children, and they try to convince people to stop the witch pursuit thingy. But Stephen Scott starts to feel guilty about all they've done in enabling the behavior, and he plans on confessing to his wife, so the other witches pin all the kidnappings on him and plot to assault him at Ross Dress for Less. But then the real witch returns, saying they aren't so different, until Mr. Garrison arrives with an orbital laser to destroy South Park's witch problem, freeing Heidi, then taking the guys out for more Jack and Crack. As this episode was being produced, a series of allegations were being made against Harvey Weinstein that eventually led to the Me Too movement, as well as a much greater degree of scrutiny on the sexual misconduct of many rich and famous men across several industries. As all of this was unfolding, several prominent figures began to speak up, either condoning the witch pursuit thingy of these men as others tried to defend the sexual deviants, usually meaning that they were trying to cover up their own actions. Sometimes a guilty conscience is the result of a person overreacting to things, but in this case it's a very blatant case of the guilty consciousness of the industry covering for things that they absolutely did. If an industry has so much assault going on behind the scenes that to prosecute it all would cause it to collapse, then maybe it should collapse. But some consider this an attack on their freedoms or whatever, that they were able to get away with sexual assault for decades before, and the fact that they could no longer rape with impunity meant that the very fabric of society was about to collapse. Like the old poem goes. First, they came for the pedophiles in the music industry, and I said nothing because I was not a pedophile musician. Then they came for the pedophiles in the film industry, and I said nothing because I was not a pedophile actor. Then they came for the pedophiles in politics, and I spoke up to say, hey, you guys are doing a great job. Fantastic job getting those guys off the streets. Doubling down. Cartman is repeatedly breaking up and then getting back together with Heidi, all while trash-talking her to his friends behind her back. Kyle asks her if she's happy in the relationship, to which Heidi gets offended, as though he were trying to make fun of her for the mistake. Meanwhile, Cartman has been going vegan with Heidi as he keeps blaming his blood sugar for his mood swings, though he lies about this by feeding her fast food and pretending it's plant-based meat, then making fun of her for being fat afterwards. Kyle tries to convince the other girls of South Park Elementary not to make fun of Heidi too much and to allow her to admit her mistake of dating Cartman. But when they take her out to dinner after a breakup, they continue to tease her for her year-long lapse in judgment, and she eventually returns to Cartman, who spent his short breakup crying to Token's family, until finding out that Heidi and Kyle are together. Meanwhile, Garrison's polling numbers are in, and his approval rating is at a historic low. Some of his cabinet members think they might be able to use this against him as a means of getting out of their relationship, only for Paul Ryan to appear in front of the news the next day with a black eye. All the other attempts by those closest to Garrison all end in failure, as the people who voted him into office are ashamed and embarrassed to admit he's not doing a very good job. In the end, Heidi meets with Cartman again and gets back together with him, telling off Kyle for being a dirty Jew while using language that Cartman uses. It's almost impossible to convince a person who was the victim of a con man that they were the victim of a con man. Most cons are about hyping people up with promises that are just vague enough that they can get away with never delivering, either by claiming non-delivery is the intended end result, or by promising something outlandish enough that any number of factors is likely to contribute to it falling apart, meaning it's technically not going to be their fault when they can't deliver. As Cartman's relationship with Heidi starts to drag her down, she can't find a way out without someone telling her, "I told you so," because she made the poor decision in the first place. This is made worse by the fact that Cartman himself is always trying to manipulate her into believing that she can't leave, so she constantly looks for some sort of silver lining to the relationship she can't escape, justifying it as being for the best by arguing that it could be worse. Of course, it could be worse, but only if she stops playing along with what Cartman wants. All of this would have been avoided if people just offered her an out. People love to save face around others, and the best way to get someone to admit they were wrong is by allowing them to admit that they were wronged. Give someone the ability to admit that they were swept up in the fervor of a con man to make it seem like they aren't entirely to blame while still not absolving them of the mistake entirely. Focus more on the future than the past, on how that person is going to never make the mistake again. Ironically, it's Cartman who wins Heidi over by doing exactly this. He tells her that all of her problems are not her fault and gets her to admit, incorrectly, she was taken advantage of by Kyle, making her even more like Cartman in the process. Moss Piglets. The Special Ed Science Fair is coming up, and Nathan's model volcano is no match for Jimmy and Timmy's work on training water bears to do the hokey pokey. So a jealous Nathan tries to sabotage the project by electrocuting the animals after tossing in a concoction of poisons, but this backfires as the animals instead become much more intelligent. This gets the attention of men in suits, who hope to save everything by using Jimmy's research into intelligent water bears to make a new generation of NFL fan to save football amidst declining viewership. Nathan tries to take credit for making the water bears super smart, but the real threat to their research comes from Heidi, who views the fact that she volunteered to judge the science fair as discrimination because the school is spending time and attention on these special needs kids instead of her. So she ropes Cartman to helping her sabotage the fair by kidnapping the animals, only to get cornered. In spite of Cartman's attempts to calm her down, she drinks the tardigrades so no one can have them, and then gets gassy every time she hears the hokey pokey. Between this episode and the last one, Heidi has finally become Cartman 2.0, the same personality and sense of entitlement, but actually having the drive to do something with this selfishness. Where Cartman tends to complain and only really acted malicious when he felt he was wrong, Heidi will go out of her way to be wronged, and then act on that, picking fights just to have a fight picked. Like last season, she's a provocateur, shutting down the special ed science fair because she personally doesn't want to attend instead of just making up something about a scheduling conflict. There's a lesson here tying to the previous episode's themes, as well as the overarching plot of the season, that spending time around toxic people tends to make you just as bad, especially when your relationship to those people starts to become a larger and larger defining point of your life. I just realized this episode's plot is a pun along the lines of retardigrade. Super hard PC-ness. To better address the increase in bullying in South Park Elementary, mostly caused by Cartman and Heidi, PC Principal hires a new vice principal, Strong Woman. But her ability to speak politically correct starts to cause Hootie and the Blowfish to play in PC Principal's head, something he gets diagnosed as romantic feelings. He brings in a new counselor, Miss Conduct, to address his potential crush, only for her to start flirting with Mr. Mackey. Meanwhile, Kyle is upset about the new Terrence and Phillip revival on Netflix, considering the humor to no longer be funny as he feels for the people being farted on. So he launches a campaign to silence Canadian humor in spite of the warnings from his friends that he is starting to sound kind of like his mom. Eventually, stopping a taping of the Terrence and Phillip show with other Millennials Against Canada. These protests attract the attention of Garrison, who is then visited by the Canadian Minister of Streaming, demanding that Americans stop boycotting Canadian goods, which only angers Garrison into launching a nuclear bomb, destroying Toronto. The missile alert for this bomb causes PC Principal and Strong Woman to evacuate the students into the gym, where the two argue over whether it's appropriate to hold a door for someone, eventually holding hands. Almost every punchline in comedy comes at the expense of another person or group. Even things as simple as puns come at the expense of the person being told the pun, as the expected reaction is to roll one's eyes due to anticipating a better joke. Anytime you laugh, you're either laughing at or with someone, and how well that someone takes the joke is the key difference. As long as a joke is considered more funny than it is offensive, everything is fine. The problem arises when the joke is repeated again and again, as anything that reruns is bound to do. Each time you hear a joke, it gets a little bit less funny, leaving only the offensive part behind. Sure, the first time someone gets farted on, it's hilarious, but as you see the farts get more and more played out, you start to imagine the person on the other end of the joke more and more, until soon the insult outweighs the comedy and it just becomes mean-spirited. Imagine if you were bald, for example, and people always made jokes about it. To the person making the bald joke, it's funny because they don't hear it very often. But to you, who's bald, you've heard it all before so many times that it starts to become a sore subject. Considering things from the other person's side has to go both ways, though. If you only look at the victims of jokes like this, then you never consider the people who actually find it funny, while also downplaying the role humor can serve as a force for normalization. I've said much earlier that making jokes about a subject is the best way to introduce people to it, as the jokes stop being jokes and start being observations. If you're still bald, like in our example, then the best way to cope with it is to make a few jokes about it yourself, until soon it becomes an armor of sorts, where a person trying to make a joke at your expense backs off when they see that you've got a much funnier joke than theirs already prepared. Splatty Tomato. Children around South Park are starting to grow fearful over sightings of Mr. Garrison in the woods, something that a local family, the Whites, blames on South Park Elementary being run by liberals. But other kids have also seen Garrison living in the woods, asking people about his approval ratings, so they set out to hunt him down while listening to 80s music, just like in Stranger Things. Every Canadian has been called upon to strike back in retaliation for Garrison's nuclear missile launch last episode, including Ike, who leaves home in search of Garrison, with Kyle trying to track him down. When the adults realize Garrison is actually in the woods, they work together to make sure no one is feeding him, so he'll eventually leave them alone. But the Whites keep leaving sandwiches out. When they enter the woods in search of their kids, they discover Strong Woman and PC Principal camping out there, and grow sickened by the relationship. As the kids are on their 80s music montage, they keep coming across sites from the last season, where Heidi threw away her phone and where Cartman tried to get her kidnapped and so on. Eventually they find Ike, having caught Garrison in a trap, tying him up and bringing him back to town, as well as leading the rest of the kids out of the woods. They're about to celebrate their kids being safe from the predator when the whites pull a gun on the crowd, demanding the release of the president, only for Heidi to take the gun and point it at Cartman, acknowledging that everything that's happened to her is at least partially her own fault, and then breaking up with him. Garrison uses this as an opportunity to escape, and what happens next is up to the whites. Last season was all about provocateurs and people with victim complexes, and this season was all about the fallout from those ideas, not purely in the political spectrum, but the way in which people reacted to those ideas, either being validated or not. I've described in the past a group of people who love to pretend like society marching on made them victims. They went from the center of attention to being treated like everyone else, and in this change, they feel as though they lost something. This comes from a misconception that politics is about winners and losers, that it's no more than theater, and a person's party affiliation is basically like rooting for a sports team. In this instance, the white family believes that since their preferred candidate won, then all the times they've declared themselves a victim of oppression were true, and they really are being attacked by people who try to claim that Garrison is running around threatening children. This episode aged really well. But in the end, the real plot of this season is a, quote, battle for Heidi's soul, as the various forces of South Park try to see whether she'll end up as a second Cartman, or if she'll return to normalcy. And the only person who is ever truly able to influence whether she becomes the type to shout endless bad faith criticisms of the world is herself. Nobody can make a person in that situation come around, as it has to be an internal revelation. All you can do is put the evidence out there, the promises of what her life was supposed to be, and then the truth has to be discovered, not told. Dead kids. Cartman fails a math test that Token aced, which makes him suspicious because he cheated off of Token. So he comes to the conclusion that Token wrote in the wrong answers on purpose, then replaced them with the correct ones to get back at Cartman for saying he didn't like the movie Black Panther. Cartman starts following Token around, trying to get dirt on him as he does not believe that Token never saw the movie, though when he personally speaks to the guy's parents, he learns they haven't taken him to see the movie yet as it's PG-13. Cartman then concludes that Token's covering for not having seen the movie because he watched it without his parents' permission, cornering him in the bathroom to blackmail him into allowing Cartman to cheat off him once again. But Cartman spends too long on this and nearly misses the math test, so they duck and dive through the ongoing school shooting in order to just barely make it to the room on time, where Token allows Cartman to cheat anyway, only for Cartman to refuse because now he believes there's a larger conspiracy going on. And in the A-plot of the episode, Sharon seems to be the only person in South Park concerned with the ongoing issue of near-daily school shootings. For a while, the news cycle became a predictable pattern of a shooting happening, people mourning the loss, then arguing over how to best prevent future shootings without going to the extreme of doing anything. People who argued that the guns were the problem were met with pushback from gun lobbyists who argued mental health was the problem, only to encounter pushback from people who did not want to spend money on counseling. Eventually, the closest thing to a middle ground that people accepted was to send thoughts and prayers, but not too many thoughts and prayers because the school can't afford to host that many memorial services. This aggressive agreeableness manifests in other ways than useless feel-good pandering. It has the far more negative effect as making it appear as though anyone who disagrees with the general vibe is the one who has the problem, as society has deemed making a fuss as a bigger faux pas than not doing anything. Once people have decided they don't care about school shootings anymore, then the people who do care are viewed as a problem. This is then taken to a logical extreme when Stan gets shot and no one mentions it, not even his parents, as Sharon is tired of being accused of being menopausal just because she wants her son safe. People are so willing to fit in, they will change their very definition of right and wrong in an attempt to be like everybody else. A boy and a priest. Father Maxie is beginning to grow resentful of how much he's being made fun of during congregations, and seeing how depressed he is, Butters tries to help him out by hanging out with the guy and introducing him to his other friends. But nobody in South Park wants to hang out with a priest, least of all the young boys, and they all reject him. So Maxie decides to stop hosting church on Sundays, with the congregation calling their diocese to ask what to do. So the diocese sends over a cleanup crew to erase evidence of what they assume is an instance of a priest molesting boys. This crew, in addition to harassing people at Craig's birthday party, also kidnaps a few kids to use as bait to lure Maxie out of hiding, tying them up in the woods and waiting to ambush him. Maxie arrives at the spot to rescue Butters, where the others come out and reveal that they have made all of the arrangements to transfer him to the Maldives, where he won't be made fun of. Maxie is about to accept the transfer when he realizes it will mean a different priest will be sent to South Park. So he refuses, running over the cleanup crew with their cumboni and saving the boys, returning to church and ignoring the jokes made at his expense. A long while back, South Park made an episode all about priests and their illicit relationships with young boys. At the time, it was a simple joke, an exaggeration of a few news stories that they played up due to a bit of backlash, all while keeping their typical satirical tone. But these days, more and more churches are having molestation scandals to the point where they stopped being newsworthy events. What they didn't stop being, though, were cases of abuse. Just as bad if a bunch of people are up in arms about it than if no one cares. Ironically, all the media attention regarding these abuse cases has now had the opposite intended effect. People are so used to sexual assault in the church, they've stopped paying attention. It's not just the people either. The church is shown in this episode as being extremely good at quickly and quietly sweeping abuse under the rug, silencing witnesses, cleaning up the crime scene, and moving the offender to another location, as that's less work than denouncing the offending party and removing them from the organization. This implies that, were you to get rid of every pedophile in the church, there would not be enough people left to run anything. That, or the perpetrators have been around for so long, they're now the ones running the show. So of course, they want what's going on at the bottom not to spread to the top. Either way, it's such an ingrained part of society these days that the only coping mechanism is one that's done by the people of South Park, to make jokes about it. Father Maxie laments that he's powerless to stop the big deal molestation that's going on in the church, and he blames himself for not doing more, but in the end he finds himself content simply preventing misconduct at a local level, while allowing others to feel good about it in any way that they can. The problem with the poo. The city council cuts funding to Mr. Hankey's Christmas pageant in light of the guy not being as beloved as he once was. This is made worse when Mr. Hankey starts taking Ambien at night and tweeting out insulting rants targeted towards everyone in South Park. Hankey tries to sue the city for firing him, but can't find a lawyer willing to defend him. He winds up choosing Kyle, the only person who still believes in him, but Hankey keeps cursing out everyone at the trial, and his firing gets upheld. So Mr. Hankey resorts to the tactic of reinvigorating the Christmas spirit to remind everybody of why they love him, even if it is October. Meanwhile, Strong Woman is pregnant after her fling with PC Principal, trying to keep the fact that he's the father a secret due to the shameful nature of their relationship. She gives birth to 5 PC babies, who cry when people around them act bigoted, making it even more obvious PC Principal is the father, though he insists he's merely the Manny. They take these PC babies to Mr. Hankey's Christmas pageant, but the kids start crying during the performances, causing Mr. Hankey to curse them out and finally turning not only the town against him, but Kyle too. In the end, South Park says goodbye to Mr. Hankey, sending him to a town where people are far less progressive, Springfield. Kyle was the first person in South Park to believe in Mr. Hankey, and now he's the last one to believe in him, his attachment to the guy being one of the longest-running character moments from the show, but one that has not aged as well in-universe, as the once-beloved celebrity has been steadily revealed to be not so great of a person. This ties in with last season's episodes like Sons of Witches, where the Me Too movement was beginning to reveal that more and more of the very famous in the world were really sexual abusers, with each person coming up with some sort of justification that very few but the most devoted fans bought. For Mr. Hankey, it was his Ambien abuse, allowing him to act as though it's not his fault, but not really convincing everyone. It just gives a talking point to his defenders to justify, not to the general public, but themselves, why they still believe in him. But eventually, the actions of a person off the stage start to outweigh the actions of the person on stage. It doesn't matter how much Mr. Hanky brings people Christmas cheer, if behind the scenes he's such a piece of he's a terrible guy. Part of a public figure's responsibilities is that they help us forget about the rest of the world. When you're watching a movie, you temporarily want to forget that everyone on screen is an actor and the visuals are just effects rendered on a computer. You want to forget that the characters in South Park are computer images designed to emulate a paper cutout. But when you see the face of an abuser, you don't think about Christmas cheer, you just think of all the things they tweeted while high on Ambien. Integrity Farms. After an incident involving a dog's butthole serves as the last straw, Randy decides to finally live out his dream of moving away from the big city and opening a farm with integrity. The Marsh family moves out to the countryside and begins to grow marijuana alongside Towley, his quality assurance specialist. But representatives from a vaping business arrive trying to cut a deal with Integrity Farms, one Randy turns down, although his neighbors are accepting the buyouts. Meanwhile, at South Park Elementary, Kyle discovers that Ike has been vaping due to Cartman and Butter pushing product on him. He tries to get the others to stop selling his brother nicotine, but Cartman assures him that he's just too involved in drug dealing to get out, and once he pays off some debts, he'll go clean. But while Kyle is trying to negotiate to get Cartman out of his deal, Cartman simply robs his supplier, getting them into more trouble as now the 6th graders involved in pushing vapes are mad they can't get their supply. So they plan a big heist of some of the vape juice, only for Randy to enter, enraged after finding a vape pen Stan confiscated from Ike earlier. He and Towley beat up the vapors and set the whole facility to explode, ending Big Vape's dominance in South Park and returning to his farm with integrity. The town of South Park used to be, well, a town. It was a pissant white bread mountain town where things were a little behind the times, a result of the showrunners creating something based on their childhood, as they needed something to explain away a few slightly dated aspects of the show to accommodate the fact that they were referencing things they had done a decade earlier. The people of South Park reflected the parts of society that the duo most felt the need to satirize, the rural folks resistant to any upcoming changes to their way of life, while making these changes minor enough that their very resistance allowed Matt and Trey to poke fun at both sides of the issue. But as South Park ran for longer and longer, the subject of their humor started to shift as society did, and now we've gone from a bunch of lower-class, small-town conservative stereotypes to a bunch of urban elite, upper-middle-class liberal stereotypes. This mostly has to do with the fact that Matt and Trey have always made South Park semi-biographical. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny all represent something about themselves, while the town represents where they lived. But now they're making millions off of streaming deals and they live in the big city where their studio is located. This shift was not done all at once, but rather happened slowly over the last 22 seasons, but you don't need me to tell you that. We are 12 hours into the video by this point. You have certainly noticed the boys changing their activities from camping trips to playing video games. So Integrity Farms as a plotline is a reaction to South Park itself, the show losing its original setting to focus on a change in society, now returning to its roots despite those roots being long gone. The Scoots. Halloween is coming, and all the kids of South Park are planning on using e-scooters that have started appearing around town to trick-or-treat so they can get more candy. But not everyone likes these scooters, as Mackie keeps getting bumped into, growing enraged at the number of them and trying in vain to destroy as many scooters as he can, only for them to keep coming back. Unable to destroy the scooters, the adults of South Park start to worry as they realize there won't be enough candy on Halloween night to satisfy the kids coming from all over, and they clean out all the candy stores around town so they won't get egged. As Mackie is preparing, Kenny comes into his office lamenting that everyone is going to be using e-scooters but him because he doesn't have a smartphone, and this gives Mackie the idea to rush to the edge of town and take down the cell phone tower using Mackie's car to tear it down, then shutting down everyone's cell phones, causing the scooters to deactivate. Kenny's then able to join his exhausted friends for a proper trick-or-treating experience now that they're all on equal footing. Another Halloween episode, another horror movie parody. This time it's The Birds, meant to be a pun based on a company named Bird that handle e-scooter rentals. As more and more of these scooters showed up, the holiday celebrations become threatened, with the massive number of people riding around causing panic among the parents. The narration of Kenny throughout the episode implies that this is a Halloween just like the old days, as well as one of the last he ever takes part in part because trick-or-treating was already on its way out by this point. Too many people driving on the roads on Halloween night made it into the day with the highest number of pedestrian fatalities of the year, like before, causing panic among the parents. So many cars were on the road, in fact, that most neighborhoods these days do a neutered trunk-or-treat celebration, little more than a bunch of cars parked in a circle, with people walking a few steps to each one. Halloween these days is little more than a time for college-aged people to dress in skimpy costumes and get drunk, contributing to the above increase in traffic fatalities, making the holiday a lot more adult, but denying children the ability to celebrate like in the good old days. So this episode then uses its horror movie parody to create a sense of irony. Mackie complains that the scooters everywhere are ruining the holiday and that everyone should just drive around, when in real life, it's everyone driving around that's ruining the holiday. That said, when these scooters started showing up around my city, people, without coordinating, all agreed to just chuck them in the river when they saw one. Normally, I like to consider myself very environmentally friendly, save the rainforest and all that, but consider that throwing a lithium battery into the water in this case was funny. Time to get cereal. While out hunting, Jimbo and Ned discover bear, or maybe pig tracks in the field, and Ned gets carried off by a monster. Later on, this monster ends up disemboweling a kid at South Park Elementary, though the Park County Police Department investigates it as though it were just another school shooting. But Stan knows the truth. It was Man-Bear Pig. They track down Al Gore, who promises to help them out, but only after they agree to throw him a party, celebrating that he was right, and that they should have listened. Meanwhile, the police are investigating the boys as they believe they're responsible for the string of school shootings taking place outside of schools, with Sergeant Yates rushing the investigation so he can go home to play Red Dead Redemption 2. The boys and Al Gore head to the woods and perform a ritual to summon Satan so they can ask him for information on Man-Bear Pig, and he directs them to the local library. They learn that Man-Bear Pig is a deal-making demon, come to collect on a bargain he made years ago in a violent fashion. Al Gore gives up his cape and Nobel Prize, saying that the responsibility to clean up the mess of Man-Bear Pig is now with the kids. But the police don't listen, arresting the boys as Stan pleads with them to do something. Nobody got cereal. Man-Bear Pig is destroying the town of South Park, so the residents get together to decide if maybe it's possibly time to mull over considering whether or not to worry. The boys have escaped from prison by bribing the security guard with tips for Red Dead Redemption 2, and they seek out help, with Stan learning from his father that Grandpa Marsh also used to talk about Man-Bear Pig a lot. Stan goes to the retirement home to ask about Man-Bear Pig, where he learns who was responsible for the deal in the first place, the baby boomers, and he returns to the rest of the boys who have just left a long presentation by Al Gore, who tells them of this. Meanwhile, Satan has decided to fight Man-Bear Pig himself as a way to recognize that the world has been doing a lot of favors for him lately. But he gets beaten savagely, dying and returning to heaven, which makes the townsfolk agree that maybe they definitely have to think about entertaining the idea of beginning to worry at some point in the near future. Before the boys can start repelling Man-Bear Pig, though, they're about to be arrested for breaking out of prison, only for Sergeant Yates to stop the arrest, saying that he's learned a lot from having to restart his RDR2 playthrough. In the end, Man-Bear Pig agrees to stop destroying South Park if they agree to give up sports cars, ice cream, soy sauce, and Red Dead Redemption 2, but unwilling to do this, they simply delay Man-Bear Pig's return by another generation. Climate change will manifest as a series of disasters viewed through phones with footage that gets closer and closer to where you live until you're the one filming it. South Park has covered climate change before with a dedicated episode, and they've had several mentions in the past about how they believed it was all a myth, but now they're at the point of being the guys recording footage of disasters through their phone, if not an overt natural disaster, then a more subtle tragedy. South Park is in Colorado, where the duo are from. It is iconic for its snowy vistas, which are not just a way to cover for the fact that the characters do not have walk cycles by burying their legs in snow. But even looking at South Park as the show has received a few visual updates gives insight to what's different. There is a lot more green on the ground than before. Last episode was the Halloween episode, so this one takes place in November. November used to be cold. It turns out that Man Bear Pig was real. He's just not so overtly violent as people imagined him to be. Sure, part of this is the fear-mongering made by climate alarmists. They made it sound as though there was going to be an apocalyptic event happening all at once. Climate change was implied to be like the movies, where a huge tidal wave shows up, and that's it. But the non-alarmists, the experts, were the ones who pointed out the really insidious part of climate change. It's very slow. The lakes are a little drier every year. The floods are a little worse. The hurricanes cause a bit more damage. Some years it's not as bad as last year, and then the next year is the worst in history. The worst in history so far. And if you don't believe it's happening, that doesn't matter. Your insurance company does. If they oversell the impact of climate change, they lose customers due to price hikes for predicted disasters that never occur. If they undersell the impact, they lose money due to replacing houses that were destroyed by natural disasters that were never supposed to happen. So now Man Bear Pig is in South Park, and the hardest thing to do is getting enough people on board with doing something about it to prevent a total disaster. But some people are too used to their way of life and the perpetual growth that it necessitates to possibly consider making small concessions in exchange for not being mauled to death, though it's more so the people at the top who ought to be negotiating than those at the bottom. The people telling us it's our responsibility to fight off Man Bear Pig by using paper straws are the ones who fly exclusively by private jet. There's a reason the first person Al Gore asks for help is Satan, as though he is more likely to actually improve the world than people with private jets. Anyway, this episode is more of an apology episode for all of their earlier climate denial, a way of showing that they know they were wrong without completely changing the original messaging. Back when I first covered Man Bear Pig, I spoke about how the episode was less about actual climate change and more about that they didn't like Al Gore, and here they're still very consistent in thinking that he's a boring guy who talks about himself too much. Buddha Box. While discussing his recent concerns with Black Panther with his therapist, Cartman is diagnosed with anxiety, something he uses to justify being a jerk to everyone in public. After enough social interaction, he discovers the Buddha Box, a device that goes over your head and prevents you from hearing or seeing anything but your phone. After wearing the Buddha Box around town and getting in everyone's way, Kyle tells him off for using his anxiety as an excuse to dissociate, saying everybody feels anxious at times and he isn't special. But rather than accepting this, Cartman decides to go to the mayor to push Buddha Boxes on the whole town. Meanwhile, PC Principal and Strong Woman are struggling with the PC babies as they cannot seek help in raising them without risking their relationship being public. So to deal with the stress, the duo both get Buddha Boxes to use their phones instead of watching after their kids. Once unsupervised, the PC babies walk out of the house and start protesting a bar, a viaduct's construction, and even releasing a single. When this song hits the airwaves, PC Principal and Strong Woman are able to track down their kids, upset that they missed their child's first protest because they were on their phone. They announce they're banning Buddha Boxes from school grounds, but no one pays attention because they're on their phone. And realizing that no one is paying attention, Strong Woman and PC Principal finally make their relationship public. I could probably include some rant here about how cell phones are constantly exposing people to more information than the brain can really process, or about the way that the constant one-upsmanship of news corporations necessitates that they exaggerate the truth and such in order to catch people's attention. But that's a played-out idea. It's something everyone already knows. There's even a 56% chance you are currently watching this video on a smartphone right now. So instead of making a point that's already been made to the point of basic relevance, this episode takes the stance that phones aren't really the problem, but the conditions driving people to use them so much. For some, a phone is a means of shutting out the outside world. The Buddha Box is not the problem, and just an extension of that idea. And it's the fact that people feel too connected to everything going on around them at once that they use devices to drown out other sensations. The problem then is a lack of self-regulation. People use their phones to drown out the whole world, not just the parts they dislike. This is an extension of the fact that this news is overwhelming. The problem arises from the quantity of information rather than the tone. Unfulfilled. Butters is working on decorating his bike for the upcoming bike parade. with the other 4 boys deciding to join him because they haven't done anything together for a few seasons. They order several parts from Amazon to decorate their bikes according to a theme, but none of the items arrive as there's an ongoing strike among the fulfillment center employees. This strike is being led by a man named Josh Carter, a former Amazon employee who was turned into a box after a workplace accident Jeff Bezos blamed on human error. As the strike continues, Jeff Bezos himself arrives in South Park, threatening the mayor into doing more to stop the employees from organizing, and even stepping in to downgrade the Amazon Prime status of strikers. This is enough to convince Stephen Scott to cross the picket line and return to work, though no one else joins him. Hoping to get parts for their bike parade, the boys head to the South Park Mall, which they find mostly abandoned, and seeing the employees hanging around there, they make a deal with Bezos to repopulate the fulfillment center in exchange for their stuff. The next day, the boys all get their stuff specifically from Bezos in exchange for repopulating his fulfillment center, though Stewart is furious that Kenny would help break a strike, so he takes him to see a speech given by the box Josh that encourages him to show a little bit more class solidarity. This causes Kenny to give up on the parade because it's a show of excessive commercialism. Without Kenny, the boys won't be able to win the bike parade, so they decide that if they can't win, they can make everyone else lose, which they try to achieve by getting the bike parade cancelled for being offensive. Tegrity Weed is having a great week as more and more workers and consumers alike turn to Randy's business to deal with the strike, with Randy and Towley coming up with the idea to use e-scooters to deliver weed to people's houses directly. While trying to start a protest against the bike parade, the boys look for a place to buy poster board and paint, only to see that every business in South Park has shut down because of the fulfillment center. They look to Santa for a Christmas miracle, but he refuses to deliver Christmas cheer due to Mr. Hanky being driven out of town. So the boys confront the mayor directly, only for Bezos to have taken over the office, killing Kenny with an Alexa, then lecturing the kids on the destruction of the class system. But he's stopped when the town of South Park, all high on Tegrity, arrives to tell him off, with the fulfillment center being shut down and the bike parade continuing as normal. Class conflict is such an underlying part of any society that to fail to mention it during a political struggle is either ignorant or malicious. Capitalism necessitates an underclass to perform the labor, to turn the capital owned by the ruling class into products and to make the actual money. But labor organization has always threatened this system, more specifically the inequality that it is built upon. Without striking and unionizing, the system tilts further and further in the direction of a monopoly, until soon we see the whole country wind up like the city of South Park, a desolate wasteland of closed businesses and idle people with nothing to do but begrudgingly accept their role at the bottom of the social hierarchy. People are fundamentally greedy and self-interested, at least on a basic level. Organizing can cause people to combine their interests, elevating their neighbor as they understand that what's good for one person like you is good for everyone. This is where class conflict comes into play. The lower classes, or producing class, has the lowest paying jobs despite making everything. The middle class, the consumer class, doesn't make things directly but usually has some involvement in logistics or the service industry. Then, the owning class does nothing but collect a percentage of the profits of the other groups as a reward for already having a lot of money or owning the means of production. You're probably wondering, why does the working class, the largest of the economic ecosystem, not simply eat the rich? The answer is shown here as a result of the strike. The productive class resents the consumer class for exploiting their labor while not wishing to do it themselves, and the consumer class resents the producing class for demanding more compensation as it gets in the way of the consumers getting their stuff. What's important to guys like Bezos is that neither group ever acknowledges that they need the other one to stay employed. Business owners like Randy need fulfillment center employees to keep his business stocked with materials for advertising, while the fulfillment employees need someone to buy what they're shipping, or else they lose their jobs as well. The guy no one really needs, though, is the guy theoretically in charge, so his job has far more to do with oppression than creation. It's not like the forklift driver is going to suddenly forget how to drive a forklift if Jeff Bezos falls out of a window. It's not like the guy wrapping packages will forget how to use a tape spool if his manager's not there to tell him to work harder. Some of the more astute have probably noticed that what I am describing right now is capital S socialism. What has shifted about South Park is that they're able to go from a very business-friendly libertarian show to one where the whole town gets together for a workers' revolution. For one, it's a change in the connotation that word has between generations. If you're an American under 40, you don't really remember the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation looming over your head as a result of what propaganda tells you is socialism. Today's youth hears the word socialism, and instead of thinking of the Berlin Wall, they think of the Netherlands or Norway, the countries where the poorest people live like the median American. There's a little bit of irony in the fact that socialism is no longer a dirty word, meaning that South Park, a show known for using many dirty words, is finally bringing it up. Mexican Joker. In this season premiere of Tegrity Farms, Randy has noticed that his sales numbers are declining, and when he goes to some of his customers to ask why, he learns that more and more people are home-growing weed instead of buying it from him. He teams up with a few of the suits from last season to put a stop to home-growing by taking it to the courts, but the amendment is shot down. So he takes matters into his own hands and simply firebombs several homes around the city to stop the farms himself. Meanwhile, Cartman is watching an ICE raid against one of the home growers and, realizing you can now call immigration on anyone you don't like and have them thrown into a camp, he calls ICE on Kyle. Kyle is thrown into a detention center, where the staff in charge is baffled by the fact that he isn't brown, and when they take him in for questioning, he dumbs down an explanation of why it's all wrong by saying that a generation of immigrants raised to hate the US government will create a new supervillain. Fearing the rise of this Mexican Joker, the ICE agents try increasingly absurd things to get the kids on their side. Soon, Cartman is thrown into the detention center as well, where he accidentally gives Kyle an escape attempt idea, to convert all the children to Judaism to prove a point, though when the guard realizes that Mexican Joker was just an example, he relaxes. By this point in South Park's history, the show has settled into a semi-serialized script-writing method, where each individual episode will still have its hat, so to speak, but the overall season will generally follow a theme. It's not the full-on serialization we had in seasons 19 and 20, something done away with likely because of Matt and Trey's proven inability to predict the future. But it's kept not out of a desire to run the idea into the ground, but merely an adjustment of the same general concept. While predicting details of the future is impossible, predicting the general vibe of the near future is far easier. Each plot can build up to something, with that something being less of a solid plan and more the concept of a plan. They have no idea what they're doing, but they're going to do something, and they just have to vaguely point in the direction of that something until it becomes clear what it's going to be. It's not like Matt and Trey aren't good at making things up on the fly already, so why not lean into that? This episode has two plots about a bad guy being created as a reaction to the world around him, with Randy slowly becoming a towel, like a wet blanket, who starts sabotaging his own industry in order to keep more of the profits for himself, while Kyle warns ICE about the fact that terrorizing minority groups is not going to make them suddenly very obedient to the government. That detention camps people are thrown into for arbitrary reasons sounds more like a supervillain origin story than something meant to instill law and order. Because grabbing people you dislike out of their homes and throwing them into a concentration camp in another country doesn't actually make anything safer. Banned in China. Randy comes up with the idea to sell his Tegrity to China, meeting several other businessmen with the same idea, including several brands owned by Disney. But he's arrested in the Chinese airport due to having a suitcase full of marijuana and sentenced to hard labor, with Winnie the Pooh in the adjacent cell. He's released alongside several other Disney characters, though the Chinese are unhappy that he claimed they have no Tegrity. Mickey Mouse, upset that he's been struggling to break into the Chinese market due to the Communist Party believing Winnie the Pooh is a caricature of their leader, talks to Randy about how to make it appear as though they sympathize with him. But they wind up settling for simply strangling Pooh to death instead. Stan has started a metal band, Crimson Dawn, with some of the other boys, singing about how much he hates living on a farm. The producer for PC Babies hears his music and decides not to give him a record deal, but a biopic, as that's where money is. But as they're trying to film, Chinese censors keep reworking the script until soon, Stan is unable to write anything because it keeps offending the Chinese. But when Kyle and Cartman are released from ICE detention, he comes up with one last plan to do something so soulless as a cash grab it's sure to work, bringing back Finger Bang from a few seasons before realizing that he doesn't actually want to sell his soul to the Chinese. So a bit of a fun fact about the current landscape of entertainment. There's a reason why comedy in general seems to be a less and less popular genre in recent years. Humor is a very cultural concept. What's funny in one country might not make as much sense in another, and because of this, comedy movies tend to perform very poorly overseas. This is why a lot of films created with the intention of having mass appeal are either drama, romance, or action. Humor doesn't translate through closed captioning or a dub. As such, a show like South Park is really only popular in the US with a slightly smaller audience in some English-speaking parts of the rest of the world. That's not to say that South Park is going after the Chinese censorship machine because the Chinese don't like American humor or anything, but that most media in general tends to be bound by what international audiences want. This is just the logical endpoint of the widening of audiences as predicted back in Season 19, that as businesses try to sell to more and more people, they wind up shaving off the edginess, or whatever is being marketed. So it's not too weird for the overseas audiences. And in doing so, they wind up making something so soulless and corny, it can't really say anything about anybody. Far more insidious than this is the fact that it's not actually true. Businesses trying to sell media properties to overseas viewers aren't trying to sand off edges from their entire project, just the parts of the product that are offensive to authoritarian governments. Countries with better free speech protections tend to produce people who are less inclined to protest at a bit of offensive humor. That's not to say that people don't get offended, it's just that the people who are offended are in less of a position to get whatever they don't like taken off the air. Shots. Integrity Farms is celebrating 300 episodes. South Park is celebrating $300,000 made for selling Tegrity to the Chinese government. But the Marsh family is upset as the farm was Randy's dream and not theirs, and that the weed is only being sold to the Chinese so they can plant it on protesters. Leanne has been struggling to give Cartman his vaccines as he squeals like a pig and runs off whenever he sees the needle. So he decides to be a conscientious objector to the vaccines, prompting the rest of South Park to criticize the Cartman family as a danger to their children. So they hire a professional hog wrestler to grab Cartman when he tries to flee, even hosting a vaccination fair featuring several other wranglers and doctors to inoculate the kids of Colorado who are afraid of needles. Leanne visits Randy, both upset that their families don't recognize what they're trying to do for them, where she decides to be a better mother to Cartman on her own terms. She rushes to the stadium and jumps in as they're chasing Cartman, taking the vaccine for him. Later on at the doctor's office, Cartman is shocked to learn that his mother has become artistic as a result of the vaccine she took. Basically, the entire anti-vaccination movement stems from people who view a 1 in 100 chance of their child dying as preferable to a 1 in 1,000 chance that their kid becomes the type of person to make a 13-hour-long South Park video. This itself is also misinformation, intentionally stoked by people who like to take advantage of those who cannot parse scientific data, to instead make up conclusions about early phases of studies. Basically, there are plenty of people who will never take their kid to a doctor or a psychiatrist. There are plenty who will take their kid to both, if necessary. But when it comes to the type of parent who only believes in one of those groups, you're not going to find somebody who is extremely concerned with the mental health struggle of their child to the point that they would get their kid tested for autism, but who doesn't believe in vaccines and won't take their kid to the doctors. There are plenty of unvaccinated kids with autism, they just never get diagnosed because their parents don't believe in modern medicine. Like with the above issue, this episode is all about bad faith actors pushing harmful ideas while hiding under loose interpretations of their other freedoms. It's Randy arguing that people refusing to eat at the same dinner table as him is a violation of his rights, ignoring that he's helping out authoritarian governments while they oppress their people. It's Leanne arguing that she's a good mother, while her son is Eric Cartman. It's Eric saying that he's a conscientious objector to vaccines on moral ground, despite the audience knowing full well he's just afraid of the needle more than what's inside. Bad faith actions done by the type of person to make the claim that they've done all their own research, comparing the fact that they watch a few TikToks to decades of research. Let them eat goo. Cartman is furious that there is a fish paste being served in the cafeteria as a result of the other students demanding more environmentally sustainable food. But while throwing a tantrum that he can't have his meat, he has a heart attack and is rushed to the hospital. Twice. When he returns to school, he finds that meat is back on the menu, though the whole student body is carefully watching him eat it. Randy is trying to figure out a way to increase sales, and Sally has the idea to sell the cheap parts of their plants that they usually throw out as mulch. But while transporting this mulch, he learns of plant-based meats and begins to sell the Tegrity Burger, which gets people high enough not to care that it tastes bad. But other businesses start to get upset with the competition, specifically those working with a goo man, who has been selling plant-based meats around South Park. They plot with local ranchers to dump a bunch of cows on Randy's property, then use footage of him killing these cows to fuel protests against his business. Tired of lying to Cartman, Butters confesses that they've been serving goo in the cafeteria, and after a meeting with the goo man about where plant-based meats come from, Cartman acknowledges that nothing has really changed, as the cafeteria food before was just as processed as it is now. Basically, everything that you're not getting directly from a hole in the ground or a market stall is going to have been goo at some point. There's a reason that the common English phrase for when you lose a state of blissful ignorance is seeing how the sausage is made. Even if you get it from a credible butcher, like a guy in your neighborhood credible, the first thing they'll do after getting the cuts of meat is to grind it into a goo or a paste of some sort, then reshape it into what you really wanted. Basically, all food is goo at some point, or so removed from its original form, you could be eating anything and the real flavor gets added in after the fact, or, it's just salt. The major criticism of plant-based meat is that it tastes terrible, but the flavor isn't really that far off from any sort of mass-produced food from a similar supplier. In fact, if you stopped eating meat entirely for a few years and suddenly had a fast food burger, you'd almost assuredly vomit it out afterwards. It's like giving a flavor-blasted hot chip to a medieval peasant. They would be destroyed because they're not used to anything that processed, but if you acclimate someone to plant-based meat, then they'll be fine digesting it like everything else. You won't even need to get them a little high first to make it palatable. Long story short, it's slop, but so is everything. Tegrity Farms Halloween Special. Randy is celebrating his Halloween special, a new strain of weed he and Towelie have grown that they plan on distributing during a Halloween party. But Shelley is unhappy with how much energy he's spending on marijuana instead of his family, so Randy tries to connect with her, but can't do so without bringing up hemp. Unable to cope with Shelley's marijuana problem after she tries destroying his new strain with some chemicals, he asks the police to have her arrested for the night to teach her a lesson. Her cellmate is Butters, who is in jail after an argument with a mummy who's been following him since a trip to the museum over a gift that Butters re-gifted. Back at the Halloween party, the people smoking the contaminated strain start panicking over sightings of various monsters, calling the police and bringing the whole force over to Tegrity Farms for a shootout. They bring Butters as they assume he'll be able to gaslight the mummy causing it all, and Shelley arrives at well, creating a hangover cure that she splashes on her father, as she's aware that Randy was just hallucinating the whole thing. As the mummy wasn't actually causing the attack on Halloween night, Butters is forced to apologize to it, and the mummy leaves him, tired of the presumed abuse. Over 2 decades before this episode aired, Matt and Trey made the Terrence and Phillip special episode as an April Fool's Day prank to their audience, basically doing the exact opposite of what fans wanted, in order to make the audience the butt of the joke while getting a laugh in at their expense. They didn't expect the backlash to be as intense as it was, though they assumed that people were never really attached to their characters, at least not enough to get angry over not learning lore and backstory and whatnot. This sort of mentality is carried over to the modern South Park seasons, with the Tegrity Farms plotlines existing as a way to troll the audience over the fact that they wanted more content about the boys, who have been appearing less and less frequently in recent seasons. I could be cynical and say that this is an intentional way of trying to remind the audience to be more grateful for the episodes they do enjoy, like when a show kills off a character, then brings them back in the interest of drumming up attention, not only as a gimmick to attract a casual fan, but to remind the hardcore fans of their love of the cast. But the tongue-in-cheek way in which the Tegrity bit is driven so far into the ground that in-universe characters are sick of Randy, and the fact that he even sings badly over the credits music, means that this is basically the same thing we saw back in Season 2. Season Finale. Randy is arrested during his podcast due to all the home growers he bombed during the season opener, sent to prison where he can't get any weed and has to face reality. But he calls Garrison to help him out of jail, where he learns to DARVO, deny attack, reverse the victim and offender. This doesn't work because he isn't the president, so he plans to accept responsibility for his actions and serve his sentence. Meanwhile, the Whites are upset because their son was hit by a police car and nobody is protesting it because they're busy celebrating the end of Tegrity Farms. Cartman suggests that the Whites simply buy a new kid from the orphans created by the recent ice raids, and they adopt Alejandro, warning him about how much harder his life is going to be now that he's a White. They start protesting to release Randy from custody, getting no attention and blaming this on persecution due to being Whites. But they have gotten the attention of Garrison, who sends Rudy Giuliani over to coax Randy with some marijuana, to pretend he wasn't actually the man in the video blowing up the homegrown farms, but that it was Mexican Joker. He can't actually go through with this, hoping to keep his tegrity as well as integrity. But at the protest, while trying to force Alejandro to wear sunscreen, he runs away, starting a protest because he wants his parents back and terrifying the police as they believe he is the real Mexican Joker. Randy gets set free and he goes back to the farm to talk about the end of the season. The fall season, releasing the season finale strain and waiting for the next year of Tegrity Farms to start all over. Like so many other episodes this season, the story here is all about bad faith victimhood, that people will pretend they're under attack when a natural response to their actions occurs. It's the White family pretending that people being more concerned with bringing a domestic terrorist to justice is a bigger deal than accidental fatalities, and that they're being oppressed because no one cares what they have to say. Any difference in the cases is purely secondary to who's involved in it. This is basically the outline of every cultural grift that's happened recently. If a person breaks the law and gets punished for it, then they argue they're being unfairly victimized, especially if they are getting better treatment than others in the same situation. Because the real victims usually don't get to loudly and repeatedly pronounce what's going wrong without actual pushback from the people in charge. As an example from this very episode, the White family constantly talks about how oppressed they are, lecturing a child about their hardship when earlier that morning the kid was in a cage separate from his family. When he reacts to try to get attention to the fact that his parents are in some unknown location, the police open fire as they think that he's Mexican Joker, while the White family was allowed to openly protest that people didn't feel sorry enough for them. Bored Girls. Nicole and Tammy join the Dice Studs club the rest of the boys are in, joining their games to the annoyance of Cartman, who wanted the club to be for boys only. The boys try playing more difficult games to scare off the girls, but they look up rulebooks beforehand and begin to win with power gaming moves. So Cartman begins protesting to the government and the school to make gender-segregated board game clubs, only to regret this when the girls form the Bored Girls, which is far nicer than what the boys had. Strong Woman has been training for the Strong Woman competition recently, though she gets second place to Heather Swanson, a bodybuilder who recently transitioned, who constantly brags about her victories. PC Principal tries to stay PC about this, despite how much it's bothering Strong Woman, but Heather keeps bragging about her victory, even making callouts to Strong Woman specifically. Strong Woman reveals Heather Swanson used to be Blade Jaggert, her ex-boyfriend, who promised to get revenge for breaking up. So PC Principal attempts to call out the athlete for her bad faith transition, only to be called a transphobe and booed off stage. He's ashamed to show his face around his kids again, but the PC babies understand the nuance of the situation and welcome him home anyway. Meanwhile, Heather Swanson is bragging about being the best woman at everything while speaking at South Park Elementary, only for the girls of Bored Girls to call her out, challenging her to a series of games where they win because they read the rulebook. Concern trolling is the act of creating outlandish hypothetical situations in order to convince people to focus on more minor issues, or to convince people to give up some of their own rights out of fear, not of reality, but the falsified reality being presented by a bad faith actor. I could elaborate more about what this means, but South Park has already had an episode about this sort of thing, Butt Out. In the episode, the duo of Matt and Trey express their annoyance with the anti-smoking advocates who invent dangers about smoking, like how it might fund terrorism or that it's way more dangerous than it is, in order to make a point. Concerned trolls often justify their arguments being untrue by claiming that they had to make an exaggeration to prove a point, to convince people of their argument even though the argument is inherently weak. I bring this up because this is an episode where South Park has its Rob Reiner goo moment. They bring up concerns about PC culture and how awful it might be if a bodybuilder starts pretending to be a woman to easily win sporting events. The reality is that this would end up similarly to Cartman's stint in the Special Olympics. Unless you're already a gifted athlete, you're not just going to show up one day and start winning. The real lived experience for a lot of female athletes is already one of frequent prejudice. Sporting events are viewed by some as unwomanly, so these athletes often find themselves being told they're not real women anyway, ironically making the trans experience not too different from what most female athletes are going through. Turd burglars. An episode where the boys are hired to steal Tom Brady's poop to get South Park a healthier gut biome that ends up being overtaken by a Dune reference. An episode with way too many hats to justifiably give it a proper review. Basic Cable. In this season premiere of the Scott Malkinson show, Scott is infatuated with the new girl, Sophie Gray, who's also diabetic. He tries talking to her while warding off the other boys, eventually convincing her to come to his house to watch The Mandalorian. The catch is that he does not have Disney Plus, and when he tries to ask his father, a cable guy, to buy the service, his father grows infuriated that his own son is trying to support his competition. So the cable guys across South Park meet together, trying mostly to show up on time, but also agreeing to take out cable across the city. After messing around all day, they finally managed to cut the internet that the streaming services used, just after Scott Malkinson had bought a bootleg password from Nathan. So Sophie decides to watch The Mandalorian at one of the other boys' house, as so many different people have offered to watch it with her, and Scott throws a tantrum when they keep trying to flirt. When he demands they stop talking to his girlfriend, Sophie says they're not dating and tells him off, though when Scott starts pouting and checking his blood sugar levels, she talks with him about how they at least have some things in common. A meta-episode where the abundance of different streaming platforms causes not only the number of options in-universe to expand, but additionally is explained as causing the last few episodes to all be different properties, giving a justification for the tonal whiplash between each plotline. Over the last few years, the rise of the internet as a social tool has atomized pop culture. Once upon a time, there were only a few radio stations, but now you can listen to almost any song you want to from any platform. Even the biggest artists in the world right now are less known to the layman than decades prior. But this isn't viewed as a bad thing, just the opposite. The general audience is far wider than ever before, and there's a much greater ease to find things tailored to yourself instead of taking whatever's popular and forcing yourself to like it. This atomization of pop culture also gives greater permission for individual shows to bring their edginess back, as they don't have to have wide appeal. There's enough money to bring a specific group into a streaming service who wouldn't otherwise be there, meaning that even a niche show can be profitable as there's far less concern with competition than there is with originality, at least in theory. Many networks haven't yet caught up to the AA style of show running, where you make more shows with less budget to attract more people, instead of dumping tons of money into a prestige show and then gambling on the entire planet watching it. Not everyone is going to have a Star Wars to bring the world together. Christmas snow. It's the holiday season, and everyone is excited to drink and drive, in spite of Santa warning them about vehicle accidents spiking during Christmas. Soon they find that all alcohol has been banned until after New Year's, and the Christmas spirit leaves South Park, as no one is sure what to do until then. So Mayor McDaniels asks Randy if he can make a Integrity Farms Christmas special, even though his season is over. He and Towley brainstorm for a while before he comes up with a plan, to add Christmas spirit, cocaine, to his leftover weed to bring back holiday cheer. This works until Santa sees people crashing their cars even more, and thinking it's the weed, he gets that banned too. So Randy rushes through the legalization process for cocaine, and Integrity Farms releases its marijuana-free holiday spirit, which sells even better. So Santa takes matters into his own hands, going through people's houses like the Grinch and stealing all their coke to take back to the North Pole. But Randy intercepts him on his way over and they crash, with Santa's sleigh being ruined and risking the whole holiday. Jesus shows up, having heard their prayers, and he tells off the duo for selling cocaine during the holidays until trying it himself. Santa and Jesus realize they're being old-fashioned, and Jesus performs a Christmas miracle, causing it to snow coke over the whole town and getting everyone back on the roads, saving Christmas and drunk driving. I'm choosing the end of Season 23 as a cutoff point for this retrospective for a few reasons. The biggest one is time restraints. I can only write and record and edit so much in a month, and going any further would either drag out this video's production a bit longer and make an awkward half month of work, or cause me to rush through a few episodes and cut corners. The second reason is that seasons 24 through 26, with 27 having started airing a few days ago, are awkward mini-seasons done as a result of complications from the Paramount merger. Another big one is that it brings the retrospective full circle. South Park began as a Christmas special over 2 decades ago, so what better way to end it than another Christmas special? This even has the advantage of pitting Jesus and Santa against each other, but rather than fighting over the true meaning of Christmas, they fight over a product called Christmas spirit before coming to peace with each other, less over ideological reasons and more so because Randy's cocaine was very good. That irreverent attitude towards the real meaning of the holidays is still consistent through the show's whole run, going from the fact that people are only celebrating because they want presents to people celebrating Jesus' birthday by driving under the influence. The show was never being made as a means of presenting a proper moral influence, but is instead a reaction to and parody of the worst aspects of our culture. Outro. The first time an episode of South Park was ever pulled in its entirety from reruns on television was shortly after 9/11, when every TV show depicting a building being destroyed or a plane crashing was removed from TV. This lasted a few months before people realized it wasn't helping anybody, and the episodes were brought back once they were certain that public outcry wouldn't be enough to hurt the show. The next time an episode of South Park got pulled from TV was when they offended the Catholic Church. That then opened the floodgates for a series of episodes being pulled, and some of the harshest censorship the show has ever received. Conservative talking heads were more damaging to South Park than 9/11. It's not like that was the first time that South Park ever invited controversy, though. The showrunners actively encouraged controversy. Later seasons were even advertised by putting "Cancel South Park" on billboards around the US, causing people to look up what line the show had crossed this time and bringing more attention to it. South Park is a show that thrives on controversy. It has always been this way. It will likely continue to be this way right up until the point where they finally find a target that is the right combination of easily offended and powerful enough to influence networks. But they've always taken advantage of a shield of sorts from what's called jester's privilege. The idea that as long as you make one outlandish claim about a figure on your show, you are protected from slander lawsuits, as anything else offensive, one might say, is lumped in with the more ridiculous concepts. This is why, for example, Barbra Streisand cannot sue South Park, because when she appeared on the show, she turned into a giant robot and started thrashing the town. In the legal world, this is sometimes called the small penis defense, where you can get away with making fun of someone as long as you claim they have a small penis, as the person suing would have to argue that because of, not in spite of, their character having a small penis, people would think it was him. And this controversy has never been one-sided, at least in the aggregate. Matt and Trey have always wanted to make fun of both sides of every political issue and have generally succeeded in this, making exceptions in the interest of originality. A great example of this is the fact that they practically never made fun of George Bush, even as the rest of the media landscape lampooned the guy non-stop. They would want to make fun of the right, but since everyone else was doing that already, they focused their attention on the political left instead out of a sense of originality. That's not to say they always avoid making fun of the same people as the rest of the world, though, just the side with the biggest potential joke base. If there is a particular group that is begging to be knocked down a peg, they'll throw a tomato with the rest of the crowd. This all ties into the first point in this outro. They invite controversy because controversy brings in ratings. Punching down at a marginalized group might get 1 or 2 angry posts on Blue Sky from a 100-follower account, but that's not going to leave a lasting impact, as if they can get the President of the United States to personally rage against a juvenile joke made at his expense. Because the key to South Park's success is not that it rags on pop culture, but that pop culture reacts to them. The response to their show is part of the joke itself, from the early seasons where parents being outraged about the bawdy humor convinced their children to stay up late to check it out, to the later seasons encouraging random guys on the internet to make 13-hour-long video essays on it. South Park has made mistakes in the past, from criticizing the wrong groups to punching down at the wrong people. They've also done a lot of good, sometimes even going further than they thought with episodes that age better in retrospect. But through the entire thing, they have kept a level of authenticity by using humor to distance themselves from politics without outright ignoring it. You can tell a lot about the current political landscape by who South Park is making fun of, and you can tell even more about it by who's getting the most offended. Sometimes, this is the South Park fandom themselves. There were people out there who loved South Park for years, laughing at the show and the reactions to the show equally, then getting upset when the humor went both ways, and they started to be the ones on the receiving end of the punchline. And these were always the fake fans, the guys who FA'd a lot but never thought they'd FO. So throughout this entire video, you can track how much South Park has changed, but at its very core, it's been the same all along. If you can't laugh at yourself, you don't deserve to laugh at anyone else. Anyway, this is the outro of the video where I'm supposed to wrap all of this up neatly. Just a bit of a warning for anybody playing this in the background for their tinnitus, start looking for another video to put on after this. I'd recommend one of my own, but I'm of course very biased in this regard. Normally for a video essay, you're supposed to come up with some succinct central theme to your video's message, take everything you have said thus far, and make it all reinforce a single point. But South Park is a show older than some of the public figures it makes fun of now. It's older than a few of its fans, too. To say that they've always been trying to push a single narrative and then to act like I'm the first guy to figure it out is an insult to both of our intelligence. That's why this is a retrospective and not a video essay, even if I did call it otherwise a few times for the sake of simplicity. At the start of this video, I said something along the lines of, this video probably can't be monetized because it has profanity, please join the channel membership so I can say swear words. I think I was able to edit down some of the more egregious moments, but there's really no way to tell until this goes live. Basically, if you think you saw too many ads on the video, then you're probably fine with not giving me any money, but if it seems suspiciously reasonable with the interruptions, that means I probably can't do anything like this in the future, and you're gonna hear me say, oh my god, they unalived Kenny if I ever cover some of the new awkward seasons. Or, you know, don't spend your money. Just watching the video this long helps out a ton, even if you just have it on in the background while you play video games or cook dinner. I did not record this in a single session. I don't anticipate anyone watching it in a single session. So, with nothing left to do but include some awkward silence and a black screen at the end so the video length is a nice even number, screw you guys, I'm going home.